Hello, everyone. Because we have a tight schedule this morning, I'm going to start and welcome everyone. And as people filter in, I'll just keep on expressing that welcome, so everyone feels that and is welcome. So I am Holly Schaefer. I'm an assistant professor of 18th and 19th century art and architectural history at Brown University. On behalf of the Lewis Walpole Library and my co-organizer, Cynthia Roman, curator of prints, drawings, and paintings there, I am truly delighted to welcome you to the second day of our workshop in the series, Viewing Topography Across the Globe, with a focus on indigeneity. In a dialogue between Chanupa Hanska Luger and Marina Taikinko during yesterday's keynote, Chanupa asked us to acknowledge the land with reverence. The land that Brown University occupies is on a hill overlooking the Sakonnet River, which runs into the Narragansett Bay, home to clams, oysters, and mussels, as well as migratory birds and numerous mammals. These are the traditional homelands of the Narragansett and Wampanoag peoples, who continue to work and live in the region. The site of the Lewis Walpole Library sits on fertile land along the Pequabuck River in the Farmington River Valley. It is the homeland of the Tungsis, who are made up of many tribes. Yale University acknowledges that indigenous peoples and nations, including Mohegan, Mashantucket, Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Chattahoochee, Golden Hill Pagosset, Niantic, and the Quinnipiac, and other Algonquian-speaking peoples, have stewarded and cultivated the lands and waterways of what is now the state of Connecticut through generations. We honor and respect the enduring relationship that exists between this land and all Indigenous communities, past, present, and future. And we know that this is extremely humble, but we still wanted to state this acknowledgement. I also wanted to simply recognize that COVID is rampaging across lands and infecting millions of people, at present to dire consequences in South and Southeast Asia. Illness and the air we breathe is on many people's minds, and to those who have tuned in from that region, thank you. To open our second day, I'd like to start by reiterating some of the questions about topography raised in yesterday's fantastic talks. Topography is a European term and concept that means the study of place. Today, it is often associated with an aerial view of land, but in the early modern period, and here we're drawing specifically on the 18th century British definition, topography focused on any written or visual record of place, be it a landscape, townscape, or the city itself, the documentation of architecture, sculpture, or artifacts in an antiquarian mode. And there is an excellent project at the British Library called Picturing Places that addresses this history in depth, and Kristen will drop that link into the chat. Part of the goal of this workshop is to recognize the power of topography to visualize the land, which was framed as an imperial conceit suffused with ego by Barbara Mundi and Emmanuel Ortega yesterday, and to reframe it by thinking with indigeneity. Yesterday, our speakers drew out the powerful European conventions of topography alongside other modes of placemaking. Robbie Richardson discussed the Mi'kmaq suckerfish writings, and Heather Vermeulen focused on the self-expression of an enslaved woman through the spider figure Anansi. All of the speakers contemplated different universalities, in part by attending, and here I quote, to actions and processes rather than things, in Robbie's words, which Chanupa Hanska Luger also addressed in his talk through hand-formed, hand-formed and imprinted clay beads. And here I'm just showing you the slide, that a wide range of people contributed to bring the immense number of immigrant deaths at the US-Mexico border to a comprehensible human scale. Chanupa's project and the speaker's papers also raised the possibility for thinking about place in non-visual modes like the haptic or sonic, and stressed the longevity of early modern topographic practices into the present. These are themes that we can draw into and layer onto as we learn from artists, scholars, and curators today who are working on South and Southeast Asia and the Pacific. Part of the reason we are drawing two geographies together is that topographic practice in the early modern period did just that. Two prints by William Daniel of the West India Docks and the East India Docks point to the trade and colonialism that pushed off from these docks, even as those ventures were represented in the same manner. In his keynote at noon, Douglas Fordham will lead us through the medium of aquatint and the aesthetic language of topography to elucidate such a colonial mode of viewing through travel, print, and empire, which is the focus of his recent brilliant book, Aquatint Worlds. Now let's turn to our fantastic speakers on today's panel. And I will stop sharing and invite Jinna Kim to share her screen while I introduce her. Jinna Kim is the George P. Bickford Professor of Indian and South Asian Art at Harvard University. Her research explores diverse topics such as the female patronage of Buddhist art in medieval South Asia, the development of visual vernaculars in Indian manuscript painting, and a complex history of reappropriation of a religious site like Angkor Wat in Cambodia. Her publications include 2 monographs, Receptacle of the Sacred, Illustrated Manuscripts and the Buddhist Book Cult in South Asia, which was published in 2013, and Garland of Visions, Color, Tantra, and a Material History of Indian Painting, which was published early this year in 2021, and both by the University of California Press. It's a great pleasure to invite Jinna to speak today about Beyond Human Vision, Knowing Angkor Wat Through Topography, from a watercolor map to LiDAR capture.
Hello, good morning or good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Thank you, Holly, for inviting me to participate in this workshop, and thank you also to the organizers for putting together this really inspiring workshop. And I know how difficult it is to plan and conduct any workshop and with so many different participants from different places, but I appreciate that we're able to meet and consider this topic together. So, and I would like to start by saying I feel like an interloper here, particularly with the topic that I propose to speak about. Can you hear me okay, actually? All right. Because on understanding Angkor Wat through topography, I've written an essay on Angkor Wat's longue durée history, focusing on its transformation from a royal funerary monument dedicated to a Hindu god, Vishnu, to a Buddhist one, which was published in 2010. But contribution to the Khmer study remains there. So much new research has happened on Angkor during the past decade or so, especially in the field of archaeology, employing various innovative scientific methods, from metallurgical analysis of sculptures and carbon dating of iron clamping used in Angkor buildings, to LiDAR, light detecting and ranging, which uses a pulse laser to measure the surface of the Earth. Needless to say, the scholarship on Angkor has grown exponentially with really exciting new research, and research centers dedicated to the study of Angkor, or more broadly to the Khmer study, like the Angkor Research Program based in the University of Sydney, has been producing a lot of resources for further study of Angkor. And if you're interested in this region, I recommend that you check them out. So I'm not an expert on Angkor's topography or LiDAR technology. So if the title of this paper had given the impression that I would be talking about LiDAR generated images and what they reveal in any depth, I apologize in advance. My interest lies more on the representational qualities of these computer generated images based on emitted light sense data. So when I first saw these images on National Geographic documentary on Angkor Wat, which discussed them as the hidden megacity, the image of Angkor Wat thus revealed reminded me strongly of this painting, which is the earliest known map of the site of Angkor Wat. So before dwelling further on these images, let me first introduce the site briefly. As is well known, Angkor Wat is an impressive archaeological site located in the heart of Angkor near the town of Siem Reap in Cambodia. Patronized by the Khmer king Suryavarman II during the 12th century, the builders of the site used complex representation of Hindu mythology and historical scenes and symbolic images of the cosmic mountain to create an eternal space for Vishnu, which doubles as a funerary space for the king after his death. Angkor Wat was a royal funerary temple that is dedicated to both God Vishnu and the deceased king, who was deified as a royal ancestral spirit who went to and became part of the realm of Vishnu or Vishnu Loka. One can spend a whole month studying and visiting the site would not have seen the site's every corner and feature in their entirety. The scale is truly monumental. The core site sits on an area measuring 162.2 hectares or 402 acres. And a moat signifies the cosmic ocean on which a mountain Meru-like Khmer temple floats. And other Angkorian temples use water for cosmic symbolism in their designs. But none of the Angkorian monuments matches Angkor Wat in the scale and the effectiveness of the use of water. 2.2-mile long man-made moat creates an alluring image of the temple with reflections. And thanks to the temple's Western orientation, unique among Angkorian temples, the sunrise over Angkor Wat makes a powerful spectacle, an experience sought after by many, if not all, tourists visiting Angkor today. So it takes an aerial view to comprehend the site's layout and structure, and one wonders how the Khmer builders of the 12th century even conceptualize a monument of such a beyond human scale, not alone execute it with such precision and technological mastery. The highest nearby point from which to view the site is on top of the hill of Phnom Penh, where an earlier Angkorian temple is sited. While this does not give the sense of an aerial view, but we get a clear sense that this man-made monument was designed to convey the cosmic symbolism of Mount Meru or Sumeru with its 5 soaring towers at 5 peaks. So I'll not go into the detailed history of Angkor Wat's later reactivation as a Buddhist temple, but I would like to point out here that the name Angkor Wat, which means a city that is a monastery or city monastery, comes from its fame as a Buddhist temple. A famous Buddhist pilgrimage destination, even a Jesuit priest took note of its fame across mainland Southeast Asia in the 17th century. And its fame went beyond Southeast Asia. The earliest surviving map of Angkor Wat is this 18th century copy of a 17th century Japanese map attributed to Shimano Kenyo, an interpreter from Nagasaki, Japan. The copy is dated 1715, and Shimano Kenyo probably visited Angkor a century earlier, sometime before 1636. And the painting identifies the site with a label, it reads over here, that says this is a plan of the Jatavana Monastery. The Jatavana Monastery was built by Anandapindika for the historical Buddha Shakyamuni in Shravasti, the capital city of Koshala Kingdom in Magadha, located in present-day Uttar Pradesh in India. And the Buddha is believed to have spent as many as 19 rainy seasons in this perfectly designed dwelling for the monastic community. Ito Chuta, the Japanese scholar who initially identified this map as Angkor Wat, suggests that Shimano Kenyo was probably mistaken about his destination because he did not know any Southeast Asian languages when he got off of the Dutch ship that he took from Nagasaki. Shimano may have been aware of the location of Jatavana as a Buddhist monastery outside the royal city of Shravasti, and Angkor Wat's location in relation to Angkor Thom, the core center of the Angkor, was a perfect parallel. And maybe that's led Shimano Kenyo to identify this as Jatavana. But yet this identification of Angkor Wat as Jatavana is not as imaginative as it seems. Can go on more about the Jatavana, but we'll come back to that later briefly. The colophon under the map recounts that Shimano Kenyo went to Jatavana of Magadha in central India following the order of Tokugawa Iemitsu. The term Tenjiku in 7th century Japanese refers not just to India proper, but rather to Greater India, which included Thailand and Cambodia in its imagined boundaries. So as Noel Perry suggests, the term India too signified other entities in 16th century parlance and some 17th century
Jenna, I'm sorry, I think you're muted.
Yeah, I got muted, so I don't know what happened. Okay, so in addition, Angkor Wat was established as a Buddhist site that attracted many visitors from all over Southeast Asia by the early 17th century. So the map shows a rectangular ground surrounded by a moat with a central shrine and 4 enclosures. If we overlap the map or plan of Angkor Wat with this map, the overall structural layout is strikingly similar. The main difference is that the buildings aren't rendered in Japanese style, so to speak. It also shows more structures in between the enclosures and 2 extra breaches on southern and northern sides. So if you look at that map and compare it to this map, you do notice there are quite a number of sort of structures. And this Japanese map may be the only map that shows the subsidiary buildings that were probably built with perishable material for the monastic community residing in the Angkor Wat's vast complex at the time of Shimano's visit. And some of these, many of these buildings are identified by the captions, and they sort of indicate monastery complex and whatnot. So that's what we're looking at. And now with the lighter, let me just go to directly to this. Now with the lighter generated image, the possibility of detecting the now low structures and evidence of earlier land use has increased dramatically. And what lighter image shows, these many structures that are believed to include residential quarters with water sources next to them. So in this map from a recent study by Damian Evans and Roland Fletcher, we see that the study's authors identified a rectilinear grid pattern across the core site with water bodies or reservoirs for residents. So these blue elements are all water bodies, and the brown elements are residential structures that they identified. So in comparison to this lighter informed map, Shimano Kenyo's Japanese map does seem to represent the site close to what it may have been in the 17th century. A Buddhist monastery as a walled city with multiple buildings, including residential ones in the complex. The study by Evans and Fletcher also proposes to understand the archaeological landscape revealed through LiDAR in a more chronological framework, and proposed that many of these residential structures were there in the 12th century. And based on the Chinese envoy to Khmer Empire, Zhou Daguan's 13th century description of the number of staff at another temple site of Ta Prohm, so the authors estimate that there were at least 125,000 people residing in the complex at the service of the temple in the 12th century. That's quite a lot of people living in this site in the 12th century, if you think about it. So although I do not know much about the LiDAR technology and how the LiDAR generated data is read, what I learned from the digital humanities project that I've been working on, the Mapping Color and History, which brings together pigment analysis data on Asian painting for historical research, is that the data generated from non-invasive light-based technology in the case of pigments on manuscripts and paintings would be something like fluorescence or Fourier transform infrared, doesn't give a straightforward answer. And here I also think a lighter and non-invasive analysis of surface on paintings is quite similar in terms of how they reveal surface information non-invasively using light-emitted light sources. When I went to scientists asking to help with the pigment analysis, I thought science and technological tools will give a straightforward answer. Conservation scientists I've been working with have repeatedly reminded me how it is an iterative and interpretive process to get at identification of a pigment. What I also learned from working on the Mapping Color and History project is that it requires deep collaboration across multiple disciplines to make the scientifically generated data historically meaningful. And here, the assumption that there would have been 125,000 people residing at the complex of Angkor Wat in the 12th century seems a bit far-fetched, especially given the fact that Zhou Daguan reporting that in the 13th century, Angkor Wat was Lo Fan's tomb, and it is clear from his report that he had never been inside its space. So Zhou was not allowed in the Angkor Wat space, and it is unlikely that he would have missed reporting on a bustling city. On the other hand, if we take the evidence that this 18th century copy of the 17th century Japanese map more seriously, it does make sense that Angkor Wat was a bustling city. And coincidentally matching the magical image of Angkor Wat as a bustling city in Tomb Raider's Lara Croft, where Lara Croft meets a Buddhist monk and gets healed. Other than the extensive amount of the body of water identified in the LiDAR-based map, given that Shimkenya would have not access to such a bird's eye view, and he would have relied on walking about and taking a note in a linear fashion, the map's cursory nature is understandable, and the buildings depicted within it may be taken as sort of representative samples of a cluster of buildings that were most important for him to record. To me, what LiDAR imaging helps to establish is the validity of this 17th century Japanese map for understanding the reactivation and the Buddhist reuse of Angkor Wat from the 16th century onwards. If anything, we can take Shimano Kenyo's map more seriously in thinking about the suggestion of Angkor Wat known as Jatavana in Southeast Asia. Because according to Kei Nandaki's study, the term Jatavana had a general meaning in Old Siamese and Hmong, referring to a vihara with a three-tiered roof built to contain Buddha images, more particularly images commemorating royal ancestors, end quote. Nandakik further explains that the use of this term in Burma to refer to any triple-roofed building originated from a belief that the original Jatavana Monastery had such a roof. I believe this use of the word Jatavana to refer to a triple-roofed building might have a connection to the imagined or perceived shape of Angkor Wat, this iconic frontal image of Angkor Wat's main complex. And it's likely that this iconic status of this frontal image of Angkor Wat was established before French interest in the region. And while the representational power of Shimano's map may be limited, there's something to be said about the uncanny resemblance of this upwardly sweeping eaves of power that become part of this visual vocabulary of the representation of both the Jatavana Monastery and Angkor Wat as an iconic image in Southeast Asia. There are many more interesting stories to tell about the later representations of Angkor Wat, including the French colonial era representations and this impressive miniature replica of Angkor Wat in Wat Phra Ko in Bangkok, commissioned by King Mongkut as Rama V. And there is a book by Michael Falser, by the way, Angkor Wat, A Transcultural History of Heritage, that just came out last year, if you are interested in these stories. Although this impressive miniature model of Angkor Wat, so there remains more artistical study and research to be done. So for the sake of time, I'll end it here with a comment that while technologically generated data can provide an impressive amount of information about the vast area, especially when it comes to topography, the prodigious amount of data does not mean that we can ditch the historically focused contextual research. If anything, it calls for a lot more collaborative research across multiple disciplines to make it more meaningful and while being sensitive to the local indigenous historical context. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jenna. That was fantastic. And it also brought in the technological mode alongside kind of earlier modes of visualizing place. Thank you so much for that. I'm going to invite Dipti to share her screen while I introduce Dipti and Deborah. So next we have two presentations around the theme of Udaipur painting. I'm going to, and I'll introduce one by one. So Dipti Kara is Associate Professor in Art History and the Institute of Fine Arts at NYU. Her book, The Place of Many Moods, Udaipur's Painted Lands and India's 18th Century, was published by Princeton University Press in 2020 and awarded the Edward Cameron Dimmock Jr. Prize in the Indian Humanities by the American Institute of Indian Studies. She's working with Deborah Diamond, who is curator of South and Southeast Asian art at the Freer Gallery of Art and the Arthur M. Sackler Gallery at the National Museum of Asian Art. And together they're co-curating an exhibition called A Splendid Land. Dipti and Deborah will be discussing unexplored terrains, topography, temporality, and emotion in 18th century Udaipur. Dipti, please go ahead. Thank you so much to you both.
Thank you, Holly. Can you hear me fine? Okay, I'll start. Thank you. And thank you, Cynthia and the Lewis Walpole Library and its team for enabling this workshop. I am joining you from New York City, which occupies the land of the Lenape people, past, present, and future. And I will take you to the prosperous moods of Udaipur's 18th century terrains at a time when epidemic catastrophe is the mood of the region. So British narratives and picturesque images of ruination motivated my pursuit of objects, texts, and travels that collectively constitute a discontinuous yet intersecting archive from which we can write the history of painted lands and India's 18th century. The vantage points I discussed today are staged in this vignette. The enchanting and ephemeral mood of a monsoon downpour unfolding amidst Udaipur's lakes and hills, admired by a king from a lofty landmark terrace. The vignette suggests where we must dwell, to use Tim Ingold's formulation, to sense the sights, sounds, and indeed smells that constitute its specific ambience. By circa 1720, when an artist painted this folio, the emotions of love and longing incited by the rainy season were established across pan-Indian visual, poetic, and musical realms. Here, the painter applies feathery long strokes to turn sheets of rain into streams that run across mountains and that collect into lakes. The topography, the temporality, and the emotions localized and mapped onto terrains seen in the small painting were first revealed in a new genre of monumental paintings that extol the bhav of a place, the feel, the mood, the emotion of a place. One of the earliest large-scale Udaipur paintings on cloth, 175 centimeters long and 100 centimeters tall, depicts the mood of a city overtaken by a monumental monsoon. Against the backdrop of hills and lakes engulfed in slate gray clouds, we see a seated Amar Singh watching the stage spectacle of an elephant going wild. The painter's repetition of the bulky elephant 9 times emphasizes swift movements. Courtly audiences knew from poetic visions the image of an elephant, of a rutting elephant. It expressed the excitement that the arrival of rains aroused in humans, birds, and animals. The upper right quadrant of the setting contains the figure of a solo elephant enjoying the rains. We ponder the planar thinness of the palace's elevation, the deliberate juxtaposition of brown and buff houses with the isometric views of white temples and gateways. And in this setting, bursting with painterly details, we see white strokes gush like pouring rain into the silvery gray streams, and semicircular patterns ripple on watery surfaces. The temporal unfolding of the spectacle is matched by the immediacy of dark, heavy clouds in thick gouache that sweep the valley and sweep the painting. A largely unexplored archive of such monumental paintings created between 1700 and 1900 and associated inscriptions alert us to the capaciousness of the concept of bhav in shaping expressive and epistemic practices that mediated worldly places and landscapes. Since the 3rd century, Indian aesthetic theories dwelled on the capacity of art to capture bhav, defined as an affective or physical state that could serve as a factor for inciting emotions or for constituting emotions within the audience. The dominant bhav would lead to the ultimate aesthetic experience, rasa, that emphasizes the tasting of blended ingredients. Apart from fragmentary scribal accounts that signal affective response, the connection between bhav and pictorial arts must be pieced together from multisensorial spatial experiences, painterly emphases, compositional choices, sung topographical poetry, and ecological and political histories. As Mughal imperial authority weakened by the late 1700s for both politics and culture, the grounds for loyalties, personal friendships, and representations had shifted. Udaipur's painters and patrons realized the potential their city's unique locale, microclimate, and natural resources offered, especially to hold new political communities together. Udaipur, with its lime-washed white palaces, was established as Mewar's capital around 1559. A vignette from a genealogical scroll shows that the creation of water reservoirs fed by serpentine channels within a land surrounded by mountains was critical for its founders. One way to parse how Udaipur became the place of rain and lakes is to recognize the relationship painters established between the enduring and the ephemeral, between architecture and seasonal weather. The panoramic plenitude of the monsoon downpour was made possible by Amar Singh's newly built Badi Mahal, literally the garden palace. Built on a hillock 60 feet high, its three wings offered consummate views of mountains, lakes, and environs beyond the palaces. From the corner turrets and wide projecting balconies on the east side, one looks down at the Manek Chowk courtyard. From the windows on the north, the city spreads out beyond the triple-arched Tripolia gateway. And from the rear windows on the east, we take in Lake Pichola. The radically new viewing experience to map the lakeside terrain from higher altitudes offered here were simply unavailable earlier. The painter oriented the northern walls of the structure in the direction of the view one would see from being high up in the space of the garden palace. The town toward the north, encircling the palace complex from the northwest to the west as the clouds descend in on the valley. These collated views, drawn and observed from multiple vantage points, centered on ephemeral subjects, from the elephant spectacle to the monsoon spectacle. The portrait of Amar Singh, admiring the former from his seated position, and of the Badi Mahal, with its retaining walls demarcated by a pink buff color, from which the commanding view could be admired, seem reinforced in this panoramic vision. This juxtaposition invites viewers to inhabit the depicted landmark vantage point, signaling the novelty, enormity, and the affect of the view that the view afforded the view that was afforded by the actual place, from where the best monsoon moods could be sensed. It perhaps rained more in painting, poetry, and songs than it rained in the lands of Rajasthan. We find an ecological perspective in the Jain monk traveler Jayachand's history of 100 years. Almost each six-line verse begins with a reference to the years it chronicles. This barely studied, less idealized vernacular account reveals not simply facts about seasonal change, but how the recurrent focus on monsoons and abundance, and likewise on droughts and decline, play out in the telling of history. We hear about the nature of political conflicts and alliances, followed by verses that describe the annual rains in agricultural production, grain markets, and migration patterns. Jayachand alternates between the political and ecological story. He creates a picture of Dukal, bad times, and Sukal, good times. Storms, droughts, floods, epidemics, price fluctuations are the measure of time as much as, if not more than, the reign of kings. So what does Jayachand have to say about political and ecological time in 1699 at the dawn of Amar Singh's reign? Sukal. Good rains, good crops, and good times, however, continue only until 1704. We learn of yet another season of drought in 1705 and the ensuing years. Jechen's history of rains radically shifts our interpretation of the monumental monsoon, not because the painting could be a form simply of historical documentation, but that the stakes of idealizing monsoons were high. Associating their seasonal pleasures with an idealized, protracted, kingly temporality rather than actual annual chronological time could have been an expedient move on behalf of painters, patrons, and scribes. None of Amar Singh's monsoon paintings include inscribed dates. Just as Udaipur's rulers had funneled rain into man-made lakes, the painterly surface in a portrait of Amar Singh renders entrapped water as a significant feat of the work. The artist delighted in how water sprays from the dark sky that is heavy with paint and water, and how it drenches the prince's austere garment and drips into rivulets on the ground. Far from being decadent luxuries, the paintings of rains and lakes memorialize the bhav of a prosperous year, so it could be returned to when fortunes changed. The monsoons were essentially overwhelming. The air and smell changed, the colors of the sky changed, the sounds of birds, peacocks, and elephants changed. The wetness of rain touched the skin and tongues, and the lakes of Udaipur swelled. Concurrently, Udaipur's painters who combined landmarks and lands tapped into the power of aesthetic emotions of longing for the monsoons, and feelings of acute dependency on the water ecology of the region. Amplification of scale constitutes a meaningful material choice for the ways it made the painted subject powerful, but also for the radically different potential for enchantment by the object. It invites an immersion into slowly finding the featured moods, in the painted terrain that does not separate places, peoples, atmospheres, and affects. These representations, as Doreen Macy writes, allows landscapes and landmarks to emerge as more than points on the surface of maps, as integrations of space and time, as spatio-temporal events. It is tempting to imagine that connoisseurs might have savored and bonded over the cooling, water-drenched vision in the summer heat, possibly even ascribed efficacious power to the object, that it could bring their desires for a good monsoon to fruition, its affective power enhanced by its expanded scale. In a way, the most momentous mood to remember was to keep the arrival of rains and the image of Udaipur's forever plentiful lakes close to the heart and the mind. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dipti. That was so marvelous. Deborah, can I turn it over to you? And I'm just going to reintroduce you as you're pulling up your screen. Deborah Diamond is curator of South and Southeast Asian art at the Freer Gallery of Art and the Arthur M. Sackler Gallery, the National Museum of Asian Art. And she is currently co-curating A Splendid Land with Dipti Kara, who just spoke. And she's also curated other fantastic shows, including Garden and Cosmos and Yoga, the Art of Transformation. Deborah.
Thank you, Holly. I'm just remembering at this moment how great it was to curate next to you at the museum back in 2013. Anyway, thank you, Holly and Cynthia, for organizing this event and for inviting me. And a special thank you to Dipti, because how many speakers get a setup like that? Because she's so beautifully established how Udaipur's rendering of place was imbued with aesthetic ideals and sensate encounters that I can just plunge into a lot more tightly once I figure out how to, there. I'm going to focus a bit more tightly on the interweaving of topography and temporality in a single painting, which is an aerial view of a place about 1.5 miles from the city palace that Dipti just showed us. Like a number of Udaipur landscapes from the 1730s, this is a painting that toys with the margins of legibility. There's absolutely no sky for orientation. There's no apparent center of attention. And on top of that, it's rather a dark night. The chocolate brown terrain serves as a ground, literally, for 2 nights of entertainment provided by military training exercises. And the small scattered human figures here include the painting's patron, Maharana Jagat Singh II, and his courtiers, beloved elephants, and his servants and laborers. My talk will explore how topographic awareness, pride of place, and pleasurable memories work together to forge elite political and personal bonds. I mean, time doesn't permit me to discuss social hierarchies and inequalities, or even go into much detail on the interface between ecology and polity. But I was going to do a focus so that we can start looking at this painting together. And I'm going to look first at the terrain, and then I'm going to turn to 2 of its many temporalities. One is the narrative of the elephant fight, and the other the duration of reception. So because Google Earth is a cartographic system that we can today easily parse, I set up some comparisons that allow me to set the stage. And this painting is, as you'll see, it's literally a stage. And the stage I proffer that constitutes this topographic imaginary, building off a general concept of the imaginary as a system of meanings that govern a social structure. I see the topographic imaginary as the cultural terrain in which we see the king and his courtiers, and the king and his courtiers seeing themselves, enacting relationships with each other, with prized animals, with the kingdom's subjects, and with the built-in natural environment. So it's a social field, both literally and figuratively, and the painting and its affect cannot be understood without moving over and through this topography. Its main topographic feature is the Ayod River. So it cuts across the picture plane on a diagonal from the lower left here to the upper right, and a tributary of seasonal overflow from 2 lakes bisects it midway. The painting pretty accurately depicts the river's contours, if not those of its seasonal tributaries. So the artist may have worked from a map kept in the palace, or he may have stood on Moti Mugri Hill to capture the river's course and all its bends. So a part of that Moti Mugri Hill is visible at the bottom of the unrestored painting. And this Google map view was taken from the perspective of someone standing on Moti Mugri, and the red square there corresponds to the painting. And that frame, that's a narrative frame. This is not a landscape framed by natural borders or sky or mountains. I think the Moti Mugri view is particularly significant in terms of reception. It's a hill that the king and the court, it's not very tall, that the king and the court would have climbed. Thus, it's a vista that the painting's intended viewers would have recognized. The king certainly knew this terrain well. It was fertile crown land, some granted to noblemen whose estates and walled gardens dot this pictorial landscape. The painter emphasized its robust irrigation system by rendering 15 wells of 2 types, as well as a sluice, as taxes from agriculture were central to the state's wealth. This typography signifies and celebrates the kingdom's health and prosperity. To embed this landscape in a longer durée, I would note that most of the wells you see here became defunct in the 1960s during the Green Revolution, when electric pumps led to an extreme drop in the water table. And to bring it into the present, the satellite image on the right reveals urbanization and pollution. And as you can see, the river is filled with that algae that comes from both agricultural runoff and sewage. This might be a good moment to say that I am speaking from land that occupies the lands of the Anacostan Indians. And the Anacostia River today is filled with E. coli from sewage runoff from Washington, D.C. Now, returning to the 1970s, we have here the painting's patron, Maharana Jagat Singh, stocky young man dressed in white. He's most easily recognized by his golden halo. And ties that held the court together, Aditi alluded to this, were essentially personal affiliations. And the painting's key nobleman here is Sardar Singh, the king's brother-in-law, who has a dashing mustache and an orange turban. The only two elephants in this painting are Maidni Bao, a light gray tusker, and the darker Gararao, who has only one tusk and a chain around his front leg. They're as individuated as the human figures. They're both mature males, that is about 40 years old, and is indicated by these dark vertical streaks flowing from their temporal glands. Both are in must. In must, male elephants get particularly aggressive for a period of days or weeks each year. This is when they're in peak fighting form, and that's why this 2-day elephant fight is taking place. Elephants in South Asia were exceedingly powerful war weapons. So only emperors and kings had the prerogative to fight these trained and prized individuals. Now look, I get it that elephant fighting is abhorrent to us today, even more so when you realize that they're being goaded by fireworks and flames. But I think it's useful to recall that these fights were not just spectator sports, though they were pleasurable, but they were also military training. And the importance of war elephants in South Asia meant that elephant herds were well protected into the colonial period when they were reinscribed as big game. So the emotional ties that bond the king to courtiers and their elephants and this place is revealed when we shift our attention to the painting's layering of place and time. So I have to take you through this. You can see it's quite chaotic. I've charted all the figures on the painting. But to signify the passage of time, the artist represented each of the key players from 5 to 17 times each. And I was able to identify the geographic itineraries of the main characters over these 2 nights by cross-referencing existing places with the characters and place names in the inscription on the verso. So allow me to give you a sense of how they move across this typography. This first slide indicates the journey of the king. At point 1, he's just arrived from the city palace. And then he sort of heads eastward at points 2, 3, and 4. He crosses the Ayo River for the first evening of fights. And at point 5 is him watching the second evening's events. And here is his trusted nobleman, Sardar Singh, following essentially the same route, but he's depicted 9 times to the king's 5 times. And I'll return to the significance of that later. This is Gararao, indicated by blue dots. He begins at point 1, an estate at the painting's lower right, moves east, fights, crosses back over the river, fights again on night 2, and returns home. And this is Maidni Mao, the orange dot, who comes in from the top at point 1, fights, and then exits stage left at point 13. So let's look more closely at the fights themselves. You can see on the first night that Gara and Maidni are clashing repeatedly, goaded by fireworkers and flaming bundles of hay. Figures and flames alike are burnished patches of red, white, and gold that sit on the painting's surface, drawing our attention in frantic bursts, in staccato, excitement-generating rhythms. During the second night's combat, Gara falls into a well. This is the event's dramatic high point, and I argue the reason that this elephant fight was memorable enough to record in such topographic and temporal profusion. I mean, the painting's also quite large, about 4 feet across. So you can imagine Gara's roaring, his frantic scrambling to escape from the well, the confusion in the dark. We can see Sardar Singh dismounting. He's hitching up his jama so you can see his orange pants, and he's organizing servants and local laborers to shift bricks from a kiln into the well to create a ramp for Gara to get out. In the dark, in a small space, with a panicked elephant weighing about 6 tons, this would have been difficult and dangerous. I have a message from Holly, but it won't open. You can text it. Anyway, it would have been difficult and dangerous to create a ramp. So I'm presenting that this painting establishes Sardar Singh's logistical skills and his can-do, not afraid to get his hands dirty spirit. As Dipti demonstrated, bonds of affiliation in 18th century Udaipur were continuously reestablished by creating collective moods and memories. So this painting records not only an exciting combat, it also constitutes a record through which Sardar Singh's planning skills were remembered and praised. And we know of his skills again because they're confirmed in a poem celebrating the construction of Jagat Singh's famed Lake Palace some 7 years later. And when Jagat Singh gives Sardar Singh the job of being the master contractor, the master planner, he says, and I'm going to paraphrase, I'm sorry, Dipti, from your poetry quite awfully here, but he says, Sardar, you are intelligent, Pravina, you're very good at this sort of thing. You will be able to construct an amazing palace. So there's the palace. I will conclude with reception. As you have seen, the painting plunges its viewers into a multitude of episodes that take time to interpret. In spending that time, the king and courtiers were prolonging the pleasure of recognizing themselves and remembering that high drama and the saving of the elephant. Their perception of the narrative was grounded in knowledge of place. They knew the terrain both from a dwelling perspective, to cite Tim Ingold's work, and also from the bird's eye perspective visible from Moti Magri Hill. Their active, perceptual, sensate engagement with the world that they inherited, they built, visited, extracted revenue from, and created relationships in can be glimpsed in the structure of the painting and its topography. So in this case, the landscape is the story. The layering of time over well-traversed hills, hollows, wells, and gardens interweaves mood into place. If time permitted, we could look at how it naturalizes inherited wealth and social inequalities or issues of ecology. But it's that layering of time over place that constitutes this topographic imaginary that is the filter through which these elite selves and their relationships were fashioned. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Deborah and Dipti. That was just amazing to enter this landscape, but through two quite different topographical imaginaries, as you just so beautifully put it. Kailani, I'll invite you to open your PowerPoint while I introduce you. Kailani Polzak is a specialist of European visual culture in the 18th and 19th centuries and pays particular attention to histories of science, aesthetic philosophy, race, colonialism, and intercultural contact in Oceania. She is an assistant professor in the history of art and visual culture at the University of California, Santa Cruz. And today she will be speaking about Rising from the Ocean, Perspectives of Land and Watercraft during Cook's Third Voyage. Thanks, Kailani.
Thank you, Holly. Can everyone hear? Yes. Okay. Thank you, Holly and Cynthia, for the invitation, and Kristen for all the behind-the-scenes work that you put into this, and our other workshop participants for sharing their current research. Since we're thinking about how to write and who writes the history of place, I wanted to read the land acknowledgement written for UC Santa Cruz by the Amamutsun Tribal Band Chairman, which states that the land from which I'm joining you today is the unceded territory of the Awaswa-speaking Yupi tribe and the Amamutsun tribal band, comprised of the descendants of indigenous people taken to missions Santa Cruz and San Juan Bautista during the Spanish colonization of the Central Coast, is today working hard to restore traditional stewardship practices on these lands and heal from historical trauma. The work that I'll be sharing with you today comes from a longer project where I focus more on two lines that were relied upon to make newly encountered places visible in 18th and 19th century hydrography. The horizon viewed laterally from the ship or land, and the coast drafted, seen here, as if seen from above. It is against the horizon that navigators calculated oceanic distances and viewed previously unfamiliar land masses. In turn, they fixed those novelties into the form of coastlines on nautical charts. And the three voyages led by Captain James Cook were much celebrated for such achievements. Indeed, the most famous portrait of Cook shows him pointing at the eastern coastline of what would later be called Australia. And this chart is encircled by a bold black line that stands in both for the contours of the globe as well as the limits of the horizon. And these two lines, the horizon and coast, secure and make visible the navigator's accomplishments. traveling over vast oceanic distances, settling enduring geographical questions, exercising rational inquiry, and making these accomplishments visible. Yet we also know that it was against the horizon that British ships were first spotted by Pacific Islanders, allowing them to follow and observe the voyagers when they anchored in sheltered bays. Thus, the near shore or littoral spaces represented between the graphic constants of horizon and coast were, in actuality, spaces of mutual observation and negotiation. So, a proposal. In addition to the more typical narrative of Cook exemplified by this quotation from Bruno Latour, where he says, "This officer who traveled the world is absolutely not surprised by what he discovers." Why? Because these islands and these new peoples get to fit themselves into the cartography of that unified world, which he is in the very course of putting together. So in many ways, perpetuating many of the familiar tropes that we consider expected of 18th century hydrography. I want us to add another recollection of Cook's voyages. And this is from an Olelo Noeau, which can be translated as a wise saying or proverb. Ahika palale, hinolue o valavala ki poha. And this is what Hawaiians thought the first white men to visit the island said. It is untranslatable gibberish, repeated with laughter when one is told something utterly incomprehensible. So for all the accumulated knowledge about the Pacific's geography, its peoples, its languages, some of the earliest words spoken by British voyagers to Kanaka Oiwi, which translates to people of the bone in Hawaii, have been passed down as a shorthand for incomprehensibility. And this proverb may be related to a longer passage recorded in Samuel Kamakau's Kamaolelo Hawaii, but I prefer to look at this proverb because the iterative nature of Olelo Noeau or proverbs, that we repeat them and that we re-encounter this incomprehensibility, seems commensurate with this numerous publications, commemorative monuments, place names, exhibitions that create the impression that our encounter with James Cook continues to be an iterative one, especially at Kealakekua Bay on Hawaii Island, the place of the navigator's death. An etching of Cook's death was published and sold a year before the textual account and other images from the third voyage were released. It was also reproduced and reinterpreted in pantomimes and large-scale oil paintings. And there is an extensive scholarship on the death of Captain Cook that I'm neither going to summarize nor actually especially engage with at this moment. But looking at this print, I am struck by the ways in which it simultaneously resembles and departs from visual precedents in representing nearshore spaces that were established during Cook's second voyage, so the one prior to this one. As other scholars have noted, including Dipti Kara, our co-panelist, coastal spaces are spaces where borders are performed, contested, and negotiated, and this can often precipitate new representational forms. In the case of Cook's voyages, these nearshore areas were the site of knowledge production and assertions of authority that were sometimes pictorialized in landing scenes. I'm showing you two such scenes now. It's very likely that these scenes were composed in London after the voyage was over, and some of these pictures are peaceable, as in the landing at Middleburg Eua at left, and others are palpably hostile, as in the landing at Eromanga at right. Both prints evince the late 18th century vogue for neoclassical imagery, and both bear a clear compositional divide between mobile British sailors on the water in longboats and clusters of Pacific Islanders on shore. But their differences also merit attention. The left-hand, more idyllic scene has been populated with figures who are shown to be more fair-complexioned, and we might note that there is a building in the upper right-hand corner. The image on the right, by contrast, features a more compressed mass of figures who are depicted with darker complexions in a less orderly landscape. In the 18th century, these variations could have been interpreted according to nascent ideas of racial difference expressed both in skin color or complexion and modes of subsistence. Subsistence, or four stages theory, was formulated by writers of the Scottish Enlightenment to explain the development of societies from hunter-gatherers to commercial powers, and it was enormously influential in England in particular, as it posited both an explanation for English commercial success and England's ability to improve living conditions for those living within its reach. During Cook's voyages, where cross-cultural contact may have been brief or superficial at times, such differences might be posed at the water's edge. These landing scenes often show the large British sloops in the background, differentiating who, from this perspective, was capable of crossing oceans from those who were located across the ocean. And now let me be clear, that's me ventriloquizing what I suppose is an 18th century British perspective, because it would be neither accurate to characterize any of the peoples of the Pacific as isolated or limited to their islands, nor should we assume that all interactions took place on beaches. The fact that Cook attempted to speak Tahitian to Kanako-iwi in Hawaii, and that was even somewhat recognizable, evinces a history of exploration and travel in what Epeli Hau'ofa has termed a sea of islands conducted by ocean peoples of the Pacific. And David A. Chang has written about how aware Kanako-iwi were in the 18th century, and still are, of their voyaging ancestors. We also know from other images that Pacific Islanders frequently launched watercraft from beaches to challenge and investigate the newcomers to their waters. This is memorialized in paintings and prints, and the logs and journals from Cook's expeditions feature many passages describing Pacific watercraft and meaningful negotiations that took place on nearshore expanses of water. The print of the death of Captain Cook shows one of those negotiations that did not go well, to say the least. It still features British sailors in longboats, but without the tall-masted sloops in the background. There's less of a dramatic contrast between their craft here and the double-hulled Hawaiian va'a in the bottom right. Cook's outstretched arm in the scene has been interpreted as a peacekeeping gesture, but it's also possible to see in it a formal mirror image of the extended musket in the landing at Eromanga. But suffice to say, it's a scene of confusion. Now there are British sailors on shore and in the surf. However, like the previous landing scenes, all Kanako-iwi are shown on land. By contrast, a print released a year later, A View of Kealakekua Bay, shows more Kanako-iwi on the water and in watercraft than on shore, and we see a wide variety of watercraft here. The view conveys what was described from the Discovery and Resolution when they were anchored at Kealakekua Bay on Hawaii Island in late January 1779, so when they first anchored there. And it was here that we also have one of the first European descriptions of surfing. You can see in this figure here at the bottom center. The surgeon's mate David Samuel wrote, "These people find one of their chief amusements in that which to us presented nothing but horror and destruction. We saw with astonishment young boys and girls about 9 or 10 years of age playing amid such tempestuous waves that the hardiest of our seamen would have trembled to face." And that the sailors regarded surfing as no other than certain death is something that the historian Kevin Dawson has remarked is somewhat ironic, given that they've spent just 3 years at sea by this point. But a chart drafted by William Bly lends insight to this unease. Notations along Kealakekua Bay mark underwater rocks and foul ground, because an important aspect of the expedition's hydrographic mission was to document nearshore perils so that future navigators might avoid them. By contrast, the littoral zone is an important space of life and generation for Kanaka Maoli. In the Kumulipo, a 2,000-line cosmogonic chant that explains the origins of all life, which Cook heard while he was at Kealakekua, life begins with coral polyps, starfish, and limpets, the very creatures who would thrive on those nearshore rocks found in Bly's chart. Another chant tells of the birth of the islands. And I'm just going to read you the English. "Then arose Hawaii Nui Kea, arose from inside, from the deep dark ocean. Then appeared the island, the land, the rows of islands of Nuumea, the group of islands on the border of Tahiti. Maui was born an island, a land, a dwelling place for the children of Kamalalawalu." This passage helps us to understand 3 things. First, that the islands rise and are born of the darkness of the ocean. Second, that the genealogy of the land is tied to the genealogy of humans. Third, that Kanako-iwi have always known that their ancestors came from faraway Tahiti. The opening lines of Eamai Hawaiʻinui Akea do not merely bear witness to the birth of the islands, but their description of their emergence evokes the way that the islands first appeared to ancestral wayfinders as they approached. And I would propose that it serves as a verbal and genealogical version of what European navigators would represent as a coastal profile, though I think the minimal differentiation in tone between the sky and the water here would be significant. As with any translation, my comparison flattens some of the complexities, worldviews, and ways of knowing present. Moreover, the contexts of speech and action are as consequential as their content, as Cook would learn when he returned to Kealakekua Bay when it was under a kapu, or sacred restriction. So I know I'm out of time, but I'll close by saying that the next step for thinking about the relationship between content and context, imagistic chant, and British pictorial representation will be an investigation of this Ipumakani o La'amaumau, a wind gourd that contains the winds of Hawaii Island, carved from fine Hawaiian hardwoods and decorated with engraved brass rings. The widest of these rings here is engraved with scenes from Cook's third voyage. In fact, Weber's engravings of Kealakekua Bay, of watercraft, and portraits of people. And so thinking about the type of placemaking that the wind gourd and the prints would enact together here and give new genealogy to Weber's depiction of place. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kailani. That was just marvelous. And thank you for ending on this unbelievable object that captures something invisible, right? Yet one that we can feel. So bringing us back to this notion of the senses. Aisha, I'll invite you to open your presentation while I introduce you. Aisha Ramachandran is Associate Professor of Comparative Literature at Yale University. Her first prize-winning book, The World Makers, published by University of Chicago Press in 2015, provides a cultural and intellectual history of the world, showing how it emerged as a cultural keyword in early modernity. Her current projects range from new research on early modern and contemporary South Asia to work on comparative philology, cartography, oral history, and lyric studies. Today, she will be speaking about Topographies of Battle, the National War Memorial, New Delhi. And Aisha, you might be talking about this, but this is also such a contested site right now. And so thank you in advance for discussing it.
Thank you so much, Holly, and thank you, Cynthia, for inviting me. I should say that when we initially talked about this, gosh, well over a year ago, life looked and the world looked different, and I thought I might be doing the thing I normally do as an early modernist, which is to talk about early modern things. But when I sort of switched gears to say that I would talk about this new project that I'm working on, I did not quite realize how contested this would become, though it was already contested in 2019 when it was inaugurated. So I just want to start by joining Cynthia and Holly in the land acknowledgements for the land that we are on in Connecticut. I am currently in New Haven. But I'm also thinking about the contested land far away right now in COVID-ridden India, at the center of that in New Delhi, which I'm going to take us to today. I should also say, before I get started, that I am very much an interloper. This is not normally my scholarly terrain, but as I hope will become clear, part of why this discussion of this extremely recent war memorial is part of this workshop is also because its spatial memory, its thinking about land, its efforts at placemaking reach far back into the early modern period and even beyond. So my paper picks up on several of the themes that have already been evoked in this workshop: the imperial gaze, colonial vision, the complex forms of territoriality in text and image, and thinks about them in the context of a specific kind of monument, the war memorial. I focus specifically on the new Indian National War Memorial in New Delhi, India, inaugurated in February 2019, shortly following the military standoff and border skirmishes between Indian and Pakistani forces, when for a moment there was global concern about another war between two nuclear powers. I hope you can fix this image in your head. I'm going to come back to it at the end of my talk today. But just to sort of notice the way in which it's not just the memorial that's topographically interesting, as I will get to, it's the way in which it reshapes the landscape of the city itself at the heart of a long, complicated depiction of colonialism and post-colonialism at the center and sort of heart of the nation, so to speak. So I'll come back to these themes. So I want to begin here with the sort of inauguration chronology of the National War Memorial, just to get a sense of how much is layered into this place. And those layers are both spatial and temporal, and kind of open and collapse as you know, one moves through it or looks at it from the kind of aerial view. So on 14th February 2019, there was an attack in Kashmir, known now as the famous Pulwama attack, in which 40 Indian soldiers of the border forces were killed. 10 days later, on 25th February 2019, the Prime Minister inaugurated the National War Memorial, though it was not yet complete. And in the early morning hours of 26th February, the nation was informed that an airstrike had been carried out against Pakistani territory, and the nation was on alert for an attack. You'll see I've given you an image of the Prime Minister at the National War Memorial, lighting the flame in honor of the unnamed soldier, the kind of immortal fire here called the Amar Jawan Jyoti. I'll get back to this. And it's an image that was released by the Prime Minister's office. So just to think here about kind of this sort of ideology and placemaking just from this very moment. This was the image of the National War Memorial that was tweeted out by the Prime Minister's office on 25th February, the night before the airstrikes on Pakistan. Now, I emphasize this moment of inauguration in part because though placemaking of this and sort of in the context of the War Memorial takes a lot of time to organize simply in terms of reshaping the landscape that would produce this memorial, the moment of inauguration also suggests the moment when the place has come into being, right? And the sort of significant ways in which that was mobilized for a national audience, but also within the landscape of Delhi, I think is really crucial here. You'll notice here behind, you have a towering obelisk at the center of the National War Memorial. I'll come back to this obelisk in a moment. And behind that, you see here the shape of India Gate, the war memorial to the Indian soldiers who fought and died in the First World War, in particular battles of the First World War. And projected onto India Gate here is the tricolor of the Indian Republic. So just to get a sense of that view, that sort of long topographical view of this heart of the capital city. So the National War Memorial itself was built to center the so-called military sacrifice, and the word sacrifice here is crucial, of the nation's armed forces at the political center of the national capital. Here are two maps from the War Memorial, and I should say here, all of the images of the War Memorial are pictures that I took when I was at the War Memorial probably 2 weeks after its inauguration in early March of 2019. So this also kind of records a particular moment in time. I mean, some of these things have changed in the last couple of years. You'll see here that as you enter the War Memorial, what we get are these two maps that are intended to kind of orient you literally in the topography, first of the city, here of the India Gate complex, and where it says number 1 over here is where the National War Memorial is now situated. And within that, you get another map that gives you an orientation of the rings, the ring structure of this National War Memorial. So as you go through it, as you enter into it, you are constantly being reminded of the way in which you are entering a space that has been carefully crafted to mobilize and think about the long history of the nation, but also the making of the nation as in a kind of topographic microcosm. Here is an aerial view of the part of the city in which the National War Memorial is located. You see over here where it says India Gate Circle. This is in fact the area where the National War Memorial has been built. This long central road known as Rajpath or the Royal Way leads from India Gate and the War Memorial all the way to the Houses of Parliament, Rashtrapati Bhavan. So you can see here that there is a kind of clear shaping of the relationship between the kind of political heart and the military heart and the link between them. And of course, the Republic Day Parade, which is a military parade, happens between these two places. Okay, so I want to take you to through the actual war memorial briefly so that you get a sense of what are the kind of topographic aspects of it that we need to hold in mind as we talk about what's significant here. The war memorial itself mobilizes the various affordances of topography, of landscape and architecture set across 40 acres of the site itself, of the immediate local city, of the sites of key battles. And behind all this, a mythic battle topography evoked by the circle or the chakra view, the supposedly impenetrable military formation memorialized in the epic, the Mahabharata. All these topographic overlays highlight the relationship of place and history in the shaping of national is in turn the rhetoric of empire. In this sense, the 2019 memorial draws extensively on early modern European tropes of empire and fuses them into the nationalistic post-colonial nation. So let me just walk you briefly through these the war memorials to get a sense of how we move through this space. And I've given you a little graphic here from the Times of India to give you a sense of how these circles actually work. And I'll just take you visually through them now. So you have an outermost circle comprising trees here, young saplings, which at the time had recently been planted, a circle of protection that's supposed to symbolize the soldiers of the Indian Army. The next circle is a so-called circle of bravery, which has granite blocks commemorating soldiers who died in a particular set of wars from 1947 to 1965. And here you get the sense of what these blocks look like. Then there is a further inner circle where you have 6 murals, these kind of bas-relief murals that you can see over here in bronze that mark 6 key battles of the Indian Armed Forces. And what I want to emphasize here is the astonishing just kind of topographic evocation here. This first image on the left is the Battle of Longewala fought in the Thar Desert on the India-Pakistan border. You can see here the Air Force, sort of commemoration of the Air Force in the corner here, cut off is the tank. But what we get here is the desert topography that is highlighted in this incredible mural. And on the right is the Battle of Rezangla, kind of very important sort of quixotic battle on the Indo-Chinese border and fought at one of the highest elevations in the world. And you see here the evocation of the mountains of the men dying here, caught in this hospitable terrain. At the very center of these set of circles as you go in is in fact this obelisk, when we now have a kind of relocated sort of eternal flame honoring the unnamed soldier. And I'm going to say, I'll have more to say about the obelisk in just a second, but I want to highlight here the way in which you move through a series of commemorative walls to give us a sense of how we move through that kind of space. So some quick thoughts on the obelisk, because I know I'm kind of running out of time here. I want to point out the way in which the obelisk itself evokes a long history of nationalistic and imperial military conquest, which is both a part of Indian history, indigenous Indian history, as it is borrowed from Western notions of conquest. Rana Chinna notes that despite its strong and deeply entrenched military institutions, modern India had not developed a unique culture or language of commemoration, either in the period prior to independence or after it. Commemorative practice was not unknown in ancient and medieval India, he writes, as evidenced by the existence of funerary hero stones and in monumental form by jayastambhas or victory pillars, and the more commonly found chhatri or elevated dome that marked cremation sites. What I want to give you a sense of here is the range of the kind of commemorative pillar and the so-called obelisk motif that is both indigenous and imported. And here's the Ashoka pillar itself. We can talk about the kind of vexed question of, is it indigenous or is it in fact brought from the West to India? Here is early modern, the Vijayastambha at Chittorgarh. And to compare with this, the obelisk, the largest obelisk in Rome, the Lateranese, and the Washington Monument, also drawing on this rhetoric of memorialization. Closer views here of the obelisk at the War Memorial. So I want to conclude actually, and this gives you the architectural renderings, with some questions, which is, How do we think about indigeneity in the context of this kind of national war memorial? How do we ask who is being memorialized in this kind of topographic, monumental place? Are they the people who died in war? Are they in fact the branches of the armed services, the nation itself, its imperial past or its future? Is this an evocation of imperial conceit? That term that Barbara Mundy evoked so importantly, I think, yesterday. Is this a dichotomy of local and global that comes together in the reshaping of the modern city? Both topography and the war memorial are European concepts that converge through a history of colonialism. And yet the war memorial suggests how these might be mixed into a potent nationalistic cocktail that imitates colonial imperial rhetorics and memorial practices precisely as a means of asserting post-colonial nationhood. Jay Winter has noted that one way to adapt the notion of lieu de mémoire in post-colonial scholarship is to insist upon the hybrid character of colonial and post-colonial sites of memory. Each and every one, he writes, is a palimpsest, an overwritten text. The National War Memorial suggests how these might be mixed into how these in turn might draw together the histories of the First World War with the current wars that the nation seeks to fight. And I actually want to end here with the picture I started with, where you can see the shadow of India Gate and its absorption into the rhetoric of the current nation, even though it occupied this fraught place as a celebration of the British Empire and India's support of it in the First World War. So I'll end there with more questions than answers, but I hope to have given us some things to talk about. Thank you.
Aisha, fantastic. Thank you so much. And to those who were also here yesterday, Aisha, your talk so beautifully relates and complements and the dialogue but with Emmanuel Ortega's talk on Mexico and this continuity between, or I should reframing between colonialism and nationalism. Chitra and Garima, can I invite you to share your PowerPoint, and I will introduce you both. It's a real pleasure to introduce Garima Gupta and Chitra Ramalingam, who are going to be in dialogue for our last talk of the panel before the keynote. Garima Gupta is a researcher and artist based in New Delhi. She documents micro-stories and events considered tenuous in ecological wars. In bringing these flotsams of ecological wreckage, her work invites us to witness as this refuse transforms into molecules of loss, migration, wants, imagination, obsessions, frivolity, and attachment, beckoning a change with and within for a radically robust future of our ecosphere. Geographies of her fieldwork include Papua New Guinea, Indonesia, and Thailand, and she is currently working towards extending her research in South Asia. And I should say Garima just wrote that, and it's just, I just got chills reading it, so thank you in advance. Chitra Ramalingam is an interdisciplinary curator, teacher, and scholar working across the history of photography, the history of science, and the nature of the museum. She's Associate Curator of Photography at the Yale Center for British Art and lecturer in Yale's History of Science and Medicine program. And today, Chitra and Garima will be in dialogue about the anxieties of a bazaar, making of commodities in colonial South and Southeast Asia. Thank you both. Please take it away.
Thank you, Holly and Cynthia, for inviting both of us here. And thank you to all the lovely panelists. It's been great learning from everyone in these 2 days. Slide. The far east corner of this map in the region marked around with the rectangle is where my practice started 7 years ago, among birds. Growing up, I was quite an introvert, and I think my grandmom related to that facet of my being and took me under her wing. We were the odd duo who looked pretty much the same and did everything together. My favorite part of being with her was the moment in the day when she would get up early in the morning and feed birds on her terrace. So this was a large terrace where like hundreds of birds would congregate, and I think I'm really thankful to her for that ritual. I don't know what that meant to her, but for me, it became a large part of my sense of belonging among birds. Slide. In 2014, I traveled to West Papua because I wanted to witness the birds of paradise during their mating season. This is a time when the birds perform, call, and make elaborate nests in order to mate. I was a little bit late to this party, and birds were done mating and field experts had left by that point. So in the 4 or 5 days that followed, my guide and host in the forest, Zeth, we found a lot of time to sit and talk. Zeth is a former hunter of these birds. He mentioned to me that he used to sell these birds as a young boy. And honestly, that one sentence kind of set me down this rabbit hole of research. I wanted to know everything that there was to know about the history, the economics, the colonial mercantile trade in birds, the Paris fashion markets where they would sell hats made of the feathers from these birds, the rich collectors who would race to find a new species so that they could name it after themselves. That's it in the photo. Next slide. I basically wanted to know how a bird becomes currency. Yesterday, Robbie had a great point in his presentation about how we start seeing ourselves, the human body in the topography, that the islands are sometimes referred to as the head and the foot, which correlates to the human body. The island of New Guinea has also been historically referred to as the bird's head and the bird's tail. The oldest records are from the Dutch. They named the bird's head as Vogelkop, literally meaning bird's head. And there's a commercial sentiment here. It wasn't the same as what Robbie mentioned about belonging and home, but like a sentiment where the Dutch commercial activities were being reflected into it. Slide. That trade still exists actually and thrives through informal channels. These photos are from the interviews I've done in the recent past with taxidermists and agents who sell birds of paradise as well as other species in the international wildlife markets. Slide. So this project has been of great interest to me because it has now become a lot more than following a bird or a species. In my subsequent interviews and reading archives, looking at data, following online wildlife markets, or understanding systemic destruction of the habitats, it has given me a channel through which I am beginning to appreciate the complexity of this trade and the commodity itself. Slide. In my work, I've been documenting the events from the field and from history in an effort to build a space for understanding this loss more than just a conflict. Here is a series of drawings from an event that took place in 1981 in order to increase the productivity of the oil palm in Southeast Asia. A team of scientists was sent to Cameroon to study the palm and the palm possible pollinators for the palm. Slide. In Cameroon, they found this weevil that is endemic to the oil palm, and it was understood as the primary pollinating force in the palm. It's called Elaidiobius camerunicus, named after Cameroon. Slide. So this drawing basically documents Dr. Rahman and his team that released this weevil into, the team that brought in the weevil from Cameroon into Malaysia. And it's being released into a oil palm plantation. The transcript of this interview from that day is written at the back of this drawing. And he calls this a historic day in the history of Malaysia. Strangely, it hasn't stopped burning since the 80s. The region hasn't stopped burning. The forest fires are raging because the greed for oil palm is now a very real driving force in the topographical alteration in the region. Slide. This next set of drawings are based on an interview that took place with a taxidermist in Bangkok, and it documents a conversation and basically our exchange that happened during the 2 to 3 hours, and where we spoke about his anxieties regarding the trade and the very act of making a specimen. Slide. these drawings are based on the same event. I'll stop here and hand over to Chitra, and she will introduce the project that we've been collaborating at the YCBA.
Sorry, couldn't figure out how to unmute myself. I'm here. Sorry, let me go back. I think I skipped ahead. Okay. So Garamina and I found each other because I had been working on a project exploring the tensions between different kinds of placemaking and erasure of place that happen in two kinds of institution, the Natural History Museum and the Art Museum. In a natural history museum, like the display of minerals from Yale's Peabody Museum of Natural History, which you see on the left, natural objects, like minerals, are always identified with a specific locality of origin. So every one of these objects on the shelf there has a little label that identifies its locality. And a specimen in one of these spaces is always from just one place, the place where it is known to have occurred in nature. All other places through which it may have passed en route to the museum, on its passage through human culture and history, are irrelevant. And by the way, this display on the left is the old style teaching display at the Peabody. They also have a fancy new mineral hall, and this is what it looked like last year before the museum closed for renovation. In the collections of the Yale Center for British Art, where I work as a photography curator, and whose long gallery you see pictured on the right, artworks made in places around the British Isles and around the world made by people of many backgrounds, they become notionally British, these artworks, by virtue of geopolitical relations that for certain periods of time bound those people and places and objects to Britain, its state, and its fortunes. And as I was sort of thinking through placemaking in these two kinds of institutions, I began honing in on the mineral collection at the Peabody Museum. And I selected a group of 10 mineral specimens from locations in the British Isles, Southern Africa, Eastern Australia, Sri Lanka, and Western India. And I began researching the history of each object, beginning from the premise, the assumption that each one was a kind of migrant, a migrant object, set in motion from its landscape of origin by the British colonial project, passing through many places and many histories en route to its arrival in the Natural History Museum, where it then finds itself presented as a natural rather than a cultural object, an object from a single place. And I called this exhibition project a British Mineralogy. And in this I was inspired, or rather provoked, by the London artist and naturalist James Sowerby, who found it urgent in the early 19th century, during the period of the Napoleonic Wars, in fact, to define what a truly British mineralogy might look like. And so this 5-volume work was the first major illustrated work on mineralogy in Europe. And it was itself a kind of placemaking project, however incoherent it may have turned out, and an attempt to characterize and describe Britain as a place of unique mineral features and resources. And it was followed by another 2-volume treatise, a kind of sequel, although it actually was printed around, they overlapped, called Exotic Mineralogy. So we have British Mineralogy in 5 volumes and Exotic Mineralogy in 2. And the hundreds of hand-colored engravings by Sowerby himself that were in both sets, the British and the Exotic, were of individual specimens, mineral specimens, owned by himself or by other mineral collectors based in London. They did not depict the landscapes from which those specimens were extracted or the people involved in doing so. So it was just illustrations of the specimens themselves, like the one you see here. And for Sowerby, these illustrations seemed to have to bear the weight of a fragile British identity. And exploring the work had me wondering what it might look like to propose another British mineralogy, one which sought not to demarcate the British from the foreign, but to draw out in different ways the precise nature of the entanglement between them. And this was the point at which I realized that this project could not simply be an exhibition of minerals accompanied by text grounded in my historical research. It needed to have a visual practice as part of it, a visual practice that might restore a richer sense of place, a multi-layered sense of place to each object. And this was when I came across Gautam's work and found so many parallels between our interests and our sensibilities. And so I approached her and we began a conversation about this project that led to a full collaboration between us. So the 10 specimens that I selected became 10 drawings, and we're going to look closely at 2 of them in our presentation today. And so I'm going to start with this specimen from the Peabody Museum at Yale. And the only documentation that comes with it in the Peabody archives is the handwritten label that you can see here, which identifies it as apophyllite, and that connects it to a locale that is erroneously called the Ghats Tunnel near Bombay. This takes us to Bor Ghat, a treacherous mountain pass in the northern part of the Western Ghats. That's the basalt mountain range that runs up much of the western coast of India. And you might, in kind of looking at this landscape, remember when Emmanuel showed us these vistas in which trains slice through idyllic Mexican landscapes with the presence of a single native figure to kind of anchor the fantasy of progress there. In the mid-19th century, the Western Ghats presented a natural barrier between the British-controlled port city of Bombay and the rich resources of the Deccan Plateau, the Indian interior. So to allow Indian commodities, silk, cotton, opium, spices, to flow efficiently overseas for trade, the British needed a rail line to cut across and through these mountains. The 7-year project to lay this new railway line was the largest and most labor-intensive civil engineering project of the British Raj. It was carried out over 7 years from 1856 to 1863, so just during that period, the transition to direct rule. Around 25,000 workers died over the course of this project, most of them from cholera. The work was dangerous, the terrain precipitous, sanitation in the workers' camps was poor. But vast numbers of laborers, around 42,000 a year during the peak of the project, migrated seasonally across an extensive part of Western and Southern India to work on the new railway line. So the Bor Ghat railway works set in motion flows of capital, flows of commodity, and flows of people. And on a smaller scale, the movements of minerals, because blasting tunnels through these mountains in Bor Ghat exposed dazzling cavities lined with crystals. And the chief railway engineer, an Englishman named James Barclay, had the largest specimens saved to be distributed to natural history museums, some within India where they remain today, but most were sent to Britain. He had always insisted, Barclay had, that the railway's incursion into the Western Ghats was not just an economic and military infrastructure project, but also a scientific project. A project not just to master the mountains, but to know them, and to thereby know the geological history of the subcontinent. And a large group of the best crystal specimens were sent to the British Museum in London, where they reside today. But from this group, we know that one found its way in the 1870s to Yale, where it now resides. And I'm kind of drawing all of this out from the indication of the donor here. It says N.S. Maskelyne, he's the keeper of minerals at the British Museum. So the trajectory of this beautiful chunk of rock and crystal from deep inside a mountain in Western India to London, and then eventually on its way to New Haven, involved the transformation of a landscape through the movement on different scales of people, of earth, and of minerals. And this was the story that I had begun to delineate for myself around this object through my research. And as part of this, I had assembled a kind of visual archive for it of photographs, maps, engravings, charts, which I shared with Garima, and I'm going to hand over to her to describe where she took that material in her engagement with this mineral.
Could you move 2 slides?
Yeah, I'm trying, sorry. There we go.
That's fine. To the next one. Well, the past year has been challenging in ways that I don't really need to explain to anyone, and working collaboratively, that too across time zones, I didn't even know what to expect actually. So that's a workstation in 2020, where this is the archive that Chitra shared with me, and we would collaborate over the next 6 months through this screen. Next one. Initially, this project was supposed to be held at Yale, but owing to the pandemic, I'm sorry, owing to the pandemic, I was sent a bunch of photographs of these minerals, which I started drawing from. And since we're talking about South and Southeast Asia today, I'll discuss the two works that were made from the region. This is the apophyllite that Chitra mentioned. Next one. In retrospect, what really made these drawings come alive for me was the fact that I would often zoom into these photographs that were sent to me. And since my screen would be full at this point, I would feel like I'm inside the scene, that I'm inside the topography, the landscape, the lushness of this mineral. And that if I reached out at some point, I would actually be able to grab onto the sharp edge of a crystal. Next one. And while this was a very entertaining thought while drawing these specimens, I was also thinking about the larger belonging of the larger belonging of the rest of this mineral. That this was a piece at some point that would have fit into a landscape. That it was part of a home. Next one. And that a home wasn't just some geographic coordinates, as a label says, but it's flora, fauna, the people who would have walked across this land and who would have held and tilled it, the tectonic shifts that and the pressures that would have brought it together brought this matter into being at some point, the history embedded in the layers of this specimen, and the politics of the region. Next one. Chitra and I have been discussing both that and the loss of lives during the colonial period in the effort to build the railway lines. And this is when I came across Inca's maps of the region, which showed the newly laid railway lines. Next one. So I start playing around with these two images, and then layering them with the help of light. Actually, there's a light source behind these two drawings, which kind of combines the multiple drawings. So I also started seeing this image emerge, which was basically these railway lines that look like they are radiating from within this mineral. And for me, it felt like it was this junction of removal, erasure, and taking away from the whole. And I think we both agreed that this is what we wanted to do through this project. Next one. So this is the final drawing that we came up with for the apophyllite mineral. And I'll just play a little video for you that kind of shows how the light interacts. So that was the first drawing. I'll move on to the next mineral, which is graphite from Sri Lanka. I'll keep this one brief. When Chitra and I first started discussing this work, I think my personal attachment and attraction towards this mineral was fairly obvious because I work with graphite a lot. And so I thought I really actually want to engage with the surface and the materiality rather than the form of this specimen. Next one. So here I basically drew the entire thing as the materials topography, as though like you were looking at it from above, because the mineral actually feels like it has so many curvatures, and like it feels like some landform that is going up and down. And here I wanted to draw the materials topography and explore the idea of loss through erasing from the drawing rather than making the form itself. To suggest the idea of loss of people and loss of the topography itself. We were discussing how minds across the world have changed the way the land has been, the land can be seen, right? Like from above, like it has changed so much of the world that we understand right now. Next one. So that's the drawing of the topography of the graphite, and the next one is the final drawing that came around from that. Following this is a video again of how this the light interacts with the artwork. Chitra, maybe you want to add to this about your archival research?
Yeah. Sorry, I'm just getting my next slide up. Yeah, so in my conversations with Garima, I was explaining to her, like when we were discussing this object, that I was experiencing some frustrations in my research a little bit. I'd been researching the kind of graphite mining in Sri Lanka, and had been reading broadly on the environmental history and imagined geographies of the island, especially the way that the land was imagined and navigated and understood quite differently in Sri Lanka's coastal lowlands and its interior highlands. And I was trying to find some way that I could kind of connect what I was learning about the graphite mining industry in the region to all these kind of contrasts and divisions that, that had had such a powerful effect on modern Sri Lankan history. So the highland-lowland divide, British native, Tamil, Sinhalese, mines versus plantations, and how they might be carried by this piece of graphite. And in a way, I was expecting these constantly negotiated dualities from Sri Lankan environmental history to somehow map themselves in an obvious way onto the object itself. And it wasn't working for me in my text. I was never managing to kind of quite stitch those things together. And in the end, those glistening surfaces, that velvety metallic luster of the graphite surface, which you can see in the image from the mine shaft itself on the right, and then in the kind of graphite specimen itself, and the kind of tension between drawing medium and depicted subject, like that kind of took over in our conversation and in the final drawing as well, which I loved. And so we'll move now into a conversation between the two of us about how this project unfolded and what it meant. And as we do that, I'll just sort of be moving gradually through some more images of Garima's drawings as we talk. And so I thought we'd start, so we talked a lot between the two of us, you and me, Garima, the idea of landscape at different scales, right? And the way that we were kind of engaging with the surface of the mineral itself as a landscape in your illustration, but then the landscape from which the specimen had been removed. And then finally, the kind of larger metaphorical landscape of the politics and history around that place. And so maybe you could say a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I think we're also running a little late, so I'll try and like make this really brief. I think the one point that we were really thinking about a lot was that how landscapes from around the world have been removed and placed into a new topography, which is the museum and the collection. That how mountains and riverbeds and meteoric shower fields have been like sort of like sifted through, and like the best parts of them have now are existing within museums and drawers and cabinets. And what does it mean for our understanding of the natural world, and how do we want to like what is the legacy and what's the next archive that we're leaving for our next generation, and how do we then understand this world if it's only while our natural world is like constantly depleting, deteriorating, what does it mean to leave a world in drawers and cabinets and under like security? So I think that was one point that we were debating quite often while working on this project, and I think that's just like a thought that we would probably leave you with.
Yeah, that sounds good. Thank you so much, everyone. We're really looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much to both of you, and what incredible drawings and what an amazing process that you've shown us. I think that was so powerful. I know we're virtual and it's hard, but actually zooming in to the minerals was incredible, because you see a totally different topographic landscape. And I think that brings us back in some way to this question of scale that we're navigating with the notion of topography, right? Where it's what is the topography? What is a topography of scale in terms of the land, the temporalities of the land, as Dipti and Deborah were talking about, how we view the land, as Kailani was bringing in these kind of multiple perspectives, the notion of the island rising from the ocean, which was so profound, and where Jinna was bringing in the question of kind of recovering the temple through these different technologies and approaches, that it starts to kind of rise in the imagination. And Aisha, how you move from, I mean, this is really a contemporary monument back into the past, and to theoretically bring us into this question of the relation of how do colonialism and nationalism, what is the empire within topography that we're faced with, that we're working on. And the word that I kept on thinking about, which is weird because many of us are historians, art historians, you know, is the project of recovery. That I kept just thinking about that word, recovery, and that it's not just a history. We all know this, but it's not just a historical project. It's so connected to the present, and that's what the land is, right? It changes in the second, it changes constantly. The changes are visible sometimes over very long periods of time, sometimes immediately. And I think that also those, again, those other non-visual senses, touch, taste, smell, that are so hard to evoke, actually so hard to capture, that also is the project of not simply topography, but also just this wider notion of placemaking. That's part of our kind of interrogation, both of topography as a European concept and term, and the notion of placemaking writ large. We are on the verge of our keynote. And so what I'm going to ask everyone, first of all, thank you to our speakers. Thank you to yesterday's speakers. Thank you to the audience. What we're going to do, if you want to bear with us, what I'm going to do, two things. One, if you have questions, please put them in the chat. So take this moment, pause. If you have questions, thoughts, meditations, whatever you want, put it into the chat. References, it's always fun. I always love at workshops where other people recommend things that have come into their mind. So please do put that into the chat as well. What we're going to do now is we're going to just take a pause, a 5-minute break. Please stay within the Zoom meeting. Of course, you can always come back in, but it's just easier. So turn off your video, turn on mute. We'll take a pause, write in the chat, and then Douglas will, Cindy will come back and introduce Timothy Barringer, who will introduce Douglas Fordham, and he'll bring us into the world of Aquitaine. And then after that, we can return and have a group conversation about the thoughts, what everyone has brought to these 2 days, for which we are just incredibly grateful. So with that, I will myself pause and we'll take a break, and we'll be back at noon. And if anyone has any questions, just obviously chat, put them in the chat too. Thank you.
Okay, everyone, welcome back. That was an amazing morning panel. So brilliant papers, incredible conversations. It makes me think about Chanupa's idea about expectations and the amazing things that happen when you try to avoid them. And the others, I mean, they're just incredible conversations and questions, and so much more to explore. So I am imagining this as a beginning of more programs to come. So stay tuned, and maybe we'll reach out to you to think about developing. For now, without spending too much more time, it is my honor to introduce Professor Tim Barringer, the Paul Mellon Professor in the History of Art at Yale University, who will be introducing our keynote speaker, Douglas Fordham. Tim specializes in 18th, 19th, and 20th century art of Britain and the British Empire, 19th century American and German art and museum studies, and he has written widely on landscape and curated important exhibits on landscape and the empire. But today, as I think about all the participants in these 2 days and in past programs, what I really want to recognize is Tim's amazing role as teacher and mentor to so many students and scholars that are contributing to the study of landscape and empire and thinking with us through the questions of topography. And to thank Tim warmly for his support of the Lewis Walpole Library programs, past and present. Thank you so much, Tim. And over to you.
Thank you very much. Got a strange echo going here. Thank you very much, Cindy, for that warm introduction, and Holly and Cindy for putting together such an extraordinary, generous and expansive program. All the papers have been, I think, worthy of full discussion, and I think we've started some relationships which will continue to echo through the historiography in times to come. It's just a shame we can't all be sitting at Farmington eating your delicious snacks, which are a feature of Lewis Walpole Library hospitality. I wanted to start, as many of us has, thinking about particularly about topography with a land acknowledgement. You've heard some of this before. I'd like to share with you, though, a text which has been commonly authored by our graduate students in the department, which I think is an important one. It's a land acknowledgement that explicitly names the entangled catastrophes of settler colonialism and racial slavery, especially regarding the material foundations and ongoing functions of this institution, Yale University. Named after a slave owner, it is built on land that belongs to the Mohegan, Mashantucket Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Schaghticoke, Golden Hill, Paugussett, Niantic, and the Quinnipiac, and other Algonquin-speaking peoples. And we also acknowledge that Yale was built with and benefited from the labor of enslaved Black men and women. And I was thinking, and this is again a suggestion from our graduate students, that while participants here come from all over the globe, we should remember how profoundly communications technologies and internet infrastructures are tied to the theft of indigenous lands. And those seem particularly appropriate for the subject of today's discussions. But the pleasure today is to introduce Douglas Fordham. Doug Fordham is full professor and chair of the Department of Art at the University of Virginia, a position of significant and importance and authority in the field of art history in the USA and globally. On the UVA website, he describes himself as a historian of art and the British Empire, interested in a wide array of visual art from the 17th century to the present in the Anglophone world. And that is definitely true, but he makes it sound like something quite normal. It's really important, though, to register that Doug's appointment at UVA and his teaching there, as well as his 2 substantial monographs, have done so much to establish this as a legitimate and significant field of study, one which is in engagement with so many other fields, as we can tell from this, this event. Most people won't know, and this is a little personal thank you, that Doug actually effectively hired me for my job at Yale University, and that's quite surprising because he was a first-year graduate student at the time. But because Yale didn't take junior faculty or British art very seriously, they were happy to kind of contract out, and a little grad student advocacy went a long way. So thank you for that. Later, we were able to collaborate with our mutual friend and colleague Jeff Quilley on a conference, Art and the British Empire at Tate Britain, which was in 2001, which was notable for an extremely bibulous reception sponsored by Martini and Rossi, held with deep irony in the Durbar Court of the Foreign Office building. And I will disclose that later in the evening, the imperial iconography was subjected to a robust post-colonial critique. Doug did the lion's share of the work in pulling together the collection of essays from that event, Art and the British Empire, Manchester University Press, 2007, in which imperial topographies were a key subject of inquiry. But that book was a declaration of intent, a starting point for a mode of interrogation which has been carried forward by many scholars, but particularly by Doug's book, British Art and the 7 Years' War, Allegiance and Autonomy, published by University of Pennsylvania Press in 2010. This was one of the first monographs to demonstrate that if empire is taken seriously, our histories of British and European art must be radically reconfigured. And let me include American art in that too. That events in the American colonies, in India, in the Caribbean, had constituted and determined the course of British art and society. British art in the 7 Years' War, let's call it Fordham 1.0, focused on the Atlantic Empire as a crucible for the emergence of a British school of art, and in doing so replaced David Solkin's more insular history, Painting for Money, with its focus on consumption and polite society as the standard account of the period. The mid 18th century empire discussed in this first book took a terrible toll on the lives of people across those vast territories, as Douglas Fordham's work acknowledges. This ever expanding global geography in the maps, drawings, paintings, and print culture of the late 18th and early 19th centuries was enculturated in the very form we're discussing today, topography, or rather topographies, since each local, regional, or national incursion was contested by indigenous and enslaved people, by Maroons, by migrant warlords, by many others, multiple constituencies. And it's this larger history of entanglement of landscape, empire, and representation that is the subject of the magisterial Aquatant Worlds, Travel, Print, and Empire. I can just about lift it at risk of breaking my wrist, this magnificent volume published by Yale University Press in 2019, the work we'd hoped to launch here at Yale. There is a reason to link this project to the university, though, since the book is of global coverage and of why, but it is also grounded in a close study of the unrivaled collection of topographical illustrated books and prints assembled by the early 20th century military man and brewery owner J.R. Abbey, that was purchased in the 1950s by Paul Mellon, and has since 1977 has resided much of it unexamined in the Yale Center for British Art. It took Doug Fordham's restless intellect to interrogate this collection, to denaturalize its stories of empire and the stories that unfold in those plates, and to look at them again, reimagine them. The book centers on rich case studies of Thomas and William Daniels' Oriental scenery in South Asia, today's topic, and of imagery generated by William Alexander on the Macartney embassy to China in 1794, and a cluster of British artists in Southern Africa and the Cape Colony. In each case, close contextual readings reveal histories of empire marked and inflected by the work and acts of individual players, colonial officials and artists, but also by indigenous people whose agency, often overlooked in earlier accounts, is observed and respected. But the book is more than a series of case studies. It's also a pioneering exploration of media history in relation to empire, returning the aquatint to consideration both as a technology of modernity and a medium of considerable aesthetic power and artistic beauty. In short, this revisionist study pivots empire and topography back to the heart of art historical study. Of course, art history is a product itself of empire. I could say more, but that's enough. Please welcome my friend and colleague, Doug Fordham, to speak on techniques of the imperial observer, how aquatint travel books taught Britons to see. Doug, can you share your screen?
Yes. Does that look okay to everyone? Thank you so much, Tim. I owe Tim such a debt as a friend, a scholar, and as a mentor. I continue to strive to mentor and teach students, and even with even half the level of commitment and joy that he did for me. And I also want to thank Holly and Cindy for what has been a really wonderful conference. I see so many names in the Zoom link today that I wish we could I could see in person, and I hope that you're all doing well out there. I'm speaking from Charlottesville, Virginia, on the traditional lands of the Monacan people. Receiving federal recognition in just 2018, the Monacan nation is fighting to preserve the site of its pre-colonial capital, Rassawek, which you can see just at the top. This is the detail of the John Smith map of Virginia. It's at the confluence of the Rivanna and the James Rivers. And it's actually been named one of America's 11 most endangered historic places by the National Trust for Historic Preservation. And if you search Save Rasswick, which I've put down here, you can learn more about the site and the actions that you can take to help preserve it. I've improvised the title of my talk, Techniques of the Imperial Observer, from Jonathan Crary's influential book, Techniques of the Observer on Vision and Modernity in the 19th Century, which has been a hugely influential book, as many of us know. Noting that photography and French Impressionism were celebrated by art historians as radical visual departures, Crary argued that a modern regime of vision emerged earlier in the 1820s and 1830s as vision became internalized in the observer's body. Quote, once vision became located in the empirical immediacy of the observer's body, it belonged to time, to flux, to death. The guarantees of authority, identity, and universality supplied by the camera obscura are of another epoch, end quote. First published in 1990, Techniques of the Observer has been widely cited and critiqued, with art historians taking particular issue with the collapse of 18th century visuality into the black box, both real and metaphorical, of the camera obscura. And yet reading it again, I'm struck by how well it holds up in other respects. Many of its arguments comport well with the social history of science, with Bruno Latour's actor network theory, and with the powerful dialectic between objectivity and subjectivity traced by Lorraine Daston and Peter Gallison. There is one area, however, in which Techniques of the Observer feels particularly dated and lacking, and that's in its hermetic focus on Europe. Vision and modernity, in Crary's subtitle, are conceived as an exclusively European pairing, as if the global expansion and violence that transformed the world in the early decades of the 19th century had no significant impact on either. And I'm juxtaposing Crary's 1839 illustration of a surgical procedure on the eye, which is on the cover, with a 1794 etching of a skin graft operation. And this is the story of Kawasji, appears in Holly Schaefer's superb new book, Grafted Arts, the Marathas in the British and Western India from 1760 to 1820. As the print shown here states, Kawasji was a Maratha bullock driver who was employed by the East India Company Army in the War of 1792. And it was in this state that he was captured by the troops of Tipu Sultan and punished for his treachery by cutting off his hand and his nose. He makes it back to the British lines, where eventually he becomes the recipient of one of the first recorded skin graft operations in history. And that's what the print is recording here. The skin, you can kind of make it out from the diagram at the bottom, was pulled down off the forehead over a wax model of his nose, and the graft, it kind of took. In the printed portrait, Kawasji looks out at the viewer, his facial features restored perhaps, but his eyes are haunted by the experience. What happens to Crary's vision and modernity, we might ask, when Britons turn their eyes to India? Or what happens when Kawasji himself becomes the observer in question? How and where are time, flux, and death allowed into these new regimes of vision? And what are the implications for their repression and their displacement? Taking Crary's thesis as a starting point, I want to complicate the shift from 18th century camera obscura to 19th century stereoscope, which was the technology that kind of culminates Crary's account as a fully kind of disembodied visual technology. And I want to add some new techniques to the observer's toolkit. The tonal printmaking method of aquatint, the pictorial travel book, and the aquatint drawing manual are three developments in particular that emerge in the pivotal decades around 1800 and which help us to think through, in concrete material terms, the emergence of modern regimes of vision. Kawasji's India feels far removed from Thomas and William Daniels' print of the ruined palace of Madura. But both prints are, in fact, products of the same imperial time and place. This print appeared in volume 2 of the Daniels' 6-volume Aquatint travel book titled Oriental Scenery. The Daniels arrived in Madras in March 1792, just 1 month after General Cornwallis had defeated Tipu Sultan at Seringapatam. With the countryside subdued by British forces, the Daniels embarked on a grand tour of southern India, supported by 48 Indian servants. The prints in Oriental Scenery, however, provide little indication of the Anglo-Mysorean wars, or of the vast number of maimed combatants, both British and India, that were both British and Indian, who were moving along its roads at this time. Oriental Scenery took the high road, so to speak, by representing the ruins of a 17th century palace rather than the recently besieged palace of Tipu Sultan. The Daniels' choice of subject matter was intrinsically related to their choice of reproductive medium. The Daniels were pioneers in the use and development of aquatint, an intaglio printing method that allowed artists to work in tonal gradations rather than hatched lines or stippled dots. Aquatint was particularly well suited to reproducing wash drawings and watercolors, two media particularly amenable to mobile traveling artists. In this detail, Thomas Daniel sits with his back to us, holding a drawing board in which he makes a sketch of the Madura Palace. A parasol bearer protects him from the heat of the sun, while he sketches the outline or general disposition of the architectural form in front of him. This is the kind of preliminary drawing that Thomas and William produced in the field. And in this drawing of a mosque in Jaunpur, they may have used a camera obscura to assist them. The reasons that I think that might have been in this case, not only the quality of the sketch, but that strange kind of recessed angle, the sharp angle of it, is probably necessitated by the narrow street in front of this gate, which didn't provide them with kind of the room to kind of move back to take the sketch they might have normally chosen. But whether protected by a parasol or covered by a blanket in front of a pinhole camera, the Daniels paid little attention to the shifting position of sun and shadows in their initial field sketches. Their practice accords well with Creary's description of the 18th century observer. Quote, "The camera obscura performs an operation of individuation. That is, it necessarily defines an observer as isolated, enclosed, and autonomous within its dark confines. It impels a kind of ascesis, or withdrawal from the world, in order to regulate or purify one's relation to the manifold contents of the now exterior world. A decisive function of the camera was to sunder the act of seeing from the physical body of the observer, to decorporealize vision." Of course, that was only the first step in the artistic process for artists like Thomas and William Daniel. Once the contours of a drawing were established, the Daniels went to great lengths to recorporealize the experience of viewing, to persuade their audience of the immediacy of their vision, to construct a persuasive simulacra of an embodied viewing experience. In Williams's journals of his travels to India, he constantly is noting that after a long day of making drawings, often with camera obscuras, they would then, by lamplight, dead color their drawings. And dead coloring is the term by which they used natural browns and grays, washes, thin washes, to add in the qualities of shadow and the impression of a moment in time. At that point, they would then touch up the final watercolor with blue washes for the sky, green for the grass and trees, and little touches, as you can see, of blue or red to kind of bring the full watercolor to life, as we see here. This is also in Jaunpur, but a different mosque that we're looking at. I want to emphasize just how difficult and technically complex it was to turn the scratchings made in a camera obscura into anything that approached a naturalistic scene. Even more impressive was their ability to turn watercolor drawings into hand-colored aquatints, with William particularly establishing himself as the premier aquatint printmaker really of his generation in London. We often associate aquatint with Goya and these really moody, very, but also kind of very bold patterned tonal prints for this moment. But in fact, much more telling and much more common in this period was the commercial side. And really on that of detail, the extraordinary detail that you can get. And if we zoom in here onto the screen, this carved screen is done entirely with variations of tone rather than etched line and shadow kind of added in. It's really an extraordinary technical accomplishment that William helped to pioneer. The prints in Oriental scenery, of which this was another example, were high wire acts running between careful visual description on the one hand and embodied experience on the other, between the immutable surface of the exterior world and the subjective record of transient effects. A book review of Oriental scenery published in the early years of the 19th century noted, quote, "Everything indeed is drawn with the most astonishing accuracy. In looking at it, one may almost feel the warmth of an Indian sky. The water seems to be in motion," end quote. It's striking to note that contemporaries valued the persuasively embodied effects just as much as the descriptive details in aquatint prints. I've suggested calling the decades between 1770 and 1830 the age of aquatint because of the medium's essential role in rendering the world as representation. As a phrase, the age of aquatint emphasizes the emergence of a distinctive worldview, and even perhaps a regime of vision in Crary's terms. Crary emphasizes Crary's emphasis on the camera obscura keeps Western perception locked into the frame of a picture window, a single view arrested in time and place. The age of aquatint emphasizes reproducibility, seriality, and also the logic and authority of the book. Even large plates like those in Oriental scenery were packaged and bound as books with an accompanying letterpress, which is seen here in original blue wrappers. Every printed image, each specific Indian temple, to take this example, is given meaning and purpose through its description, elaboration, and its contextualization in series. Aquatint travel books also, of course, represented peoples, manufacturers, plants, animals, extending well beyond the camera obscura's primary focus on landscape. The lessons offered by aquatint books operated on two distinct levels. On the level of subject matter, they tended to focus on a single geographic region or travel itinerary, thereby offering a progression of distinctive and meaningful views. On the level of style, aquatint books refined and expanded the aesthetic of the picturesque, not just as a consumer pleasure, but also as an attainable skill. These three plates are taken from an 1813 drawing manual in which amateurs learn how to make watercolors, sometimes called tinted drawings, that were based on careful observation in the field. The objective, according to its author Samuel Prout, was to, quote, "lead the student step by step to the power of drawing from nature," end quote. In the first step, the amateur was encouraged to make a drawing of a fragment of a landscape, such as a farmhouse or a bridge, and draw it on coarse wove paper with chalk or black lead pencil. And in the drawing manual, this step is approximated through soft ground etching. The next step was to dead color the drawing by adding shadows through the application of thin washes of India ink. And again, in the published manual that we're looking at here, this step was illustrated through the addition of aquatinted tones that are added on top of the soft ground etching. The author Prout writes, quote, "It is by learning to wash the shadows in imitation of aquatint that the student will become enabled to prepare his drawing for the reception of color. And hence the present watercolor drawings by amateurs have a clearness that formerly was attained only by professors, end quote. And so this is an unusually direct acknowledgement that the quality of amateurism was really driven a great deal by print culture and by this new affordability and accessibility of aqua-tinted prints. In the third and final step, the amateur was instructed to brush thin washes of watercolor over the dead colored picture, beginning first with the sky. And in the manual, this step was illustrated by hand-colored aqua tint. So in this case, both the actual watercolor and the print are finished in exactly the same way. They're done by hand with the same watercolors. So when Britons looked at aqua tints of India or Africa, they were prepared to see an artistic process as well as a landscape. Samuel Daniels' print of Lion's Head on the edge of Cape Town was created in precisely the same manner that Prout had instructed the amateur. While working in the field, Samuel made a careful drawing of a farmhouse and a mountain profile. He then dead colored his drawing to simulate the effect of light and shade, and then he enlivened the whole with touches of color. And as we've seen, aqua tint printmaking went through a similar three-step process. All of this helped the viewer feel the heat of the African sun. Crary has argued that, quote, some of the most pervasive means of producing realistic effects in mass visual culture, such as the stereoscope, were in fact based on a radical abstraction and then reconstruction of optical experience, end quote. Aqua tint travel books and drawing manuals were precursors, if not full-blown participants, in this process of abstraction and reconstruction. They encourage what I've termed the haptic picturesque, whereby amateur watercolor lessons taught Britons not just how to see, but also what to do with their hands when they traveled. The consumers of aqua tint travel books saw not only an African landscape, but also a creative process. They could imagine themselves making this watercolor, which really changes the nature of the viewing experience. With the aid of aqua tint travel books and drawing manuals, Britons learned how to turn lived experience into edifying visual units, now cataloged as natural history, ethnic costume, and material culture. Indeed, some of these units became their own kind of their own disciplines or fields of study. We can take Oriental scenery as a kind of foundational moment in the formation of architectural history, the architectural history of India. In 1807, the artist William Marshall Craig declared, quote, the man who pants for knowledge of distant nations, but whom peculiar circumstances deprives him of the power to visit them, may, by a well-chosen collection of prints, possess himself, without personal risk of exertion, of all that information which the most laborious or enterprising travelers have brought from near or remote kingdoms and states. He may view at leisure and in safety their various coasts, their rich plains, their extensive woods, their verdant or burning mountains. And he may even enter into a minute examination of their numerous productions in vegetable or animated life, end quote. Neither the purpose of this knowledge nor the means of producing these images is commented upon here. And that silence continues in Crary's techniques of the observer, leaving the voraciousness of European vision to go unremarked upon. What might be driving the European observer's need for new techniques and ever greater visual stimuli? The provocation I've offered today is to launch Crary's observer out onto the high seas, to consider how travel empire in the medium of aqua tint contributed to modern visual regimes. In the passage above, Craig notes the desire of an early 19th century observer to, quote, possess himself without personal risk or exertion of all the information, end quote, that can be found in illustrated books. The voraciousness of that vision defines the age of aqua tint, as does Craig's recognition that a vicarious alternative had emerged to the hard-won insights of global travel. Now, this printed view clearly didn't begin with a camera obscura. A Man Overboard is a print by Thomas and William Daniel that appeared in A Picturesque Voyage to India by the Way of China. It purports to show an event that the artist witnessed off the Cape of Good Hope, although they obviously never occupied this exact viewing position. Much has been made of the ways in which the railroad altered 19th century visions of the landscape. But as Paul Gilroy, Jeff Quilley, and others have argued, the sailing ship radically transformed the cultures in its wake, and it played a formative role in the development of modern subjectivities. A Man Overboard was a necessary precursor, we might say, to J.M.W. Turner's Rain, Steam, and Speed. There's a particular detail in this print that I love, which is the thin line that's etched, a thin etched line that's thrown to the drowning sailor. It's right here, and then it goes up to the ship, which he can't quite reach. In this sea of aquatint, one individual at least struggles to get a grip. The Aquatint travel book was a technical and commercial innovation that posterity has been happy to forget. It was machine printed, yet hand colored. It contained insights that were subsequently considered superficial. It made use of an etching process that was overtaken by lithography, chromolithography, photography. And it fetched high prices right up until the moment that the market collapsed with the innovations of the illustration revolution. The hybrid nature of the Aquatint travel book, however, makes it an invaluable touchstone for cultural histories of vision and of art. Belonging neither to the visual regime of the camera obscura nor the stereoscope, the Aquatint picture book lends insight into both regimes. Travel and empire transformed vision in myriad and complex ways. The Aquatint travel book is an important index of that transformation, suggesting in its highly mediated process, with its countless ocean crossings, a new means of organizing and disciplining European vision for the brutal century ahead. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Doug. I'm sure you can hear thunderous silent applause after that. I'm sure we all need a moment to think about questions for the chat. I thought that was incredibly powerful, and it returns these objects which have been marginalized to the absolute core of discussions about media and about modernity and about empire. So that's a really important thing to do. I wonder if I could start by asking a question while other people are reflecting and thinking, and do please put them in the chat. I'm keeping an eye on it. I was really taken by that quote about the armchair tourist, the man who sits at home, but I think I wrote down the quote, can possess himself of all the information of a grand tour, or sort of a global imperial tour. And I wondered about that word possess, and I wonder about the way that Aquatint in particular, that the purchase of this luxury product or medium luxury product might figure into the larger history of investment in empire, and the way in which empire is both something into which money is placed, but also, of course, from which massively money and value is appropriated. So can you put the Aquatint into the sort of larger economic history of empire? Is it, in short, something which is indexical or reflexive, or is it something that might actually have had an active role in, for example, encouraging investment in the East India Company, or encouraging people to believe that slavery is acceptable, and therefore that investment in West Indian sugar plantations is acceptable? So what possessing himself of all the information, does that lead to other forms of possession?
That's a great question. There's a lot more work to be done there, and to answer that question properly, I think, or to flesh it out in kind of individual ways. But I would just point to two things, I guess. One is that in the years in which the Napoleonic blockade really shut down the continent for the print trade, which is the years of Aquatint's flourishing, the ways in which these were marketed and sold and succeeded for the domestic market was considered a kind of salvation of printmaking at the moment. So they had a very real economic, I mean, so Boydell into Ackerman became, you know, they were those great success stories of a difficult moment for reproductive arts. So that's a very kind of simple answer to that question. Another way to answer that question with the evidence that I've been looking at is that for the really luxury publications, the big publications, they all had subscription lists. Yeah. And those are fascinating because they, depending, you know, they all had very different sets of subscribers. You know, I mean, the Prince of Wales might show up on each of them, but but otherwise they're very, very fluid as to who buys what, and they're very investment specific. So they're people who have the people that you can expect to be on each one. Let's say the Costume of China by Alexander, or Samuel Daniels' Animals of Southern Africa. These are people who have a real investment in the economic and imperial success of that region. And they see it, I think, as a means of both of promoting their endeavor and of trying to further the kind of investment and return on investment that they'd hoped for.
Thanks, Doug. I'm sure that's absolutely right. I'm sure that a detailed analysis of those lists of subscribers would reveal, you know, a kind of web of connections and investment across empire. Deborah Diamond has a really interesting comment, and maybe Deborah, you'd like to speak to this if I see you are still there, about the parallel between Aquatint in its time and you know, Google Earth now, and the sort of disembodied forms of abstraction that are so powerful for the ways that we are consuming, you know, at this very moment, consuming the world through screens. Deborah, did you want to amplify that a little? It's a really interesting thought. You have to unmute yourself if you wish to amplify.
No, I think you said it really well. I was really struck by it when I was using it in my PowerPoint. Like, I didn't want to posit that there was some objective anterior reality when Google Earth is so confected, and yet it's so compelling and we believe in it.
Yeah, I don't know if, Doug, you have thoughts on that. I was also thinking of Jinnah Kim's use of the same sort of aerial imagery right at the beginning as a method of offering a kind of comparative visual analysis. I mean, I just think it's really fascinating to think of layers of media history. I don't know, Jinnah, if you wanted to come in on that, because you used it so beautifully in comparison with your 17th, 18th century source.
I don't think I have, can I,
yeah,
am I audible? Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, no, I don't think I have a lot to add to the observation here, but yeah, no, I think there is something to be said about that comparison. I was just struck by the use of these you know, sort of digital and computer-based technology to create these images, and just so compelling, as Deborah is saying, like, just Google Earth is so compelling, but it's also kind of erasing certain elements from it. So that's why I'm emphasizing that contextual historical research is necessary. It's not going to give you an answer because it's so scientific and so, like, you know, all encompassing. It almost gives you a sense that they're going for God's view in a way, but as in the sense of enlightenment, and that's kind of repeating itself. I almost think there's kind of universalizing perspective that's perpetuated through this kind of technological innovations. And I think I want to pause there and really think about what actually historical perspectives can contribute to thinking about this type of, like, really computer generated data, like AI generated data. So anyways, that's what I have to say.
Thank you very much. Doug, did you have thoughts? I mean, I'm thinking
yeah,
at the beginning of some of these books often have a map at the beginning. So there's a sort of form of, you know, Archimedean view from above, which precedes the on the ground picturesque tourist moving through the landscape. So I'm just wondering if you have thoughts on these different regimes of mapping and looking.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, the cartography is almost always done in line and etching, right? And partly because you want to put names on there. You're naming things as you go. And it's, you know, if we take David Summers' kind of notion of real spaces, it's creating the kind of virtual cartographic space in which we all find ourselves in a certain coordinate. And then I think, and then these, but, and so aqua tint was a means of kind of, and actually one of the things I really wanted to do when I was trying to do kind of a print history of empire at this moment, and I was just drowning. And then it seemed to me the cartographic scholarship was very good, and I wanted to bracket that out. And that's actually one of the things that got me to aqua tint, was like, well, how do I do this without maps? And I think that, but you know, I think that if we stick with this virtual and real spaces, I mean, obviously these aqua tint views are also virtual spaces, perspectival views, but they're giving that kind of the feeling of real spaces, this feeling of embodied space. And I think that that's really important, that that you're getting these glimpses of perspectival space all over the world that can then be, you know, cognitively mapped onto these much more accurate, you know, global topographic maps. So they're absolutely in dialogue.
Thank you. There's a great question in the chat from Divya Kumar Dumas. Would you like to speak it, or shall I read it out?
You can read it, that's fine.
Okay, sure, it's beautifully written. So I think your presentation of the aqua tint as model for amateur drawing practice does seem to be pretty relevant when thinking about the intellectual history of landscape architecture. I'm thinking about Humphrey Repton's Red Books and wondering whether you know how much you can connect the subject matter of Oriental scenery with the English practice of drawing and visualizing landscapes as pictures to make landscapes with. So, I mean, did the world start to look like, did people start to actually apply these aqua tint images in refashioning the world?
That's a terrific question, and I would love for someone to answer that properly. I haven't. I mean, I have thought of, I have a kind of coda in my book where I talk about William Daniel's big project after he goes to India and does all of this Oriental scenery, is to do the coastal views around the British Isles. He sails around the British Isles. He doesn't always sail, but he goes around and does all the ports. And that's absolutely driven by the fact of kind of thinking like, well, we've done these extraordinary views of India. Why don't we have the same thing for the British Isles? This is crazy. And it was absolutely kind of, I don't think that idea would have happened, and I don't think the market for it would have been there had not these imperial views happened first. So it's absolutely in dialogue. The question about landscape gardening and Repton and all that absolutely they're in dialogue. I don't know how, and I would love to learn how.
I mean, the only thing I can think of is that the Brighton Pavilion emerges out of the landscape of Brighton as a result of the transmission of these architectural details through print culture. But I suspect it's massively more than that. Absolutely. There's a great question from Gillian who likes your formulation of the haptic picturesque. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, I mention it, and then I mention it and also kind of dodge it in my book a little bit, because I didn't want to put. I'm always suspicious of neologisms, especially when I come up with them. So I didn't want to push too hard, but I really do. I was becoming increasingly struck by the ways in which amateurism in England shaped the way that people both prepared to go represent what they did and selected what they did when they traveled abroad, and the ways that they might see it differently consumed back home, and just that idea that you could see a three-step process and imagine your hand tracing it, and also thinking about the ways in which you could accomplish certain things and not accomplish certain things that you saw done professionally. Struck me as really, and we could even add to that the fact that, you know, one of the things about these hand-colored aquatints before chromolithography, when it becomes industrial, in order to get, you know, if you have an addition of if you have 24 plates in addition of 100, you know, you've got a ton of hand coloring to do there. I was going to do the math. I'm not, because I want to make it, but you know, so this is, and so there are also all these people being paid to do this hand coloring themselves out there. It's often said as women and children, and it's very hard to find evidence of that. And we know that some artists like Turner and Girton made a little bit of money off doing that kind of work. But I still think there's probably ways of maybe fleshing this out more, but I just think that it's a very different exercise when we know how to, it's like watching football games when you've played or something like that. It's a very different kind of exercise than watching it cold.
Thank you. There's two more questioners, and I think we should leave it at that and then move to a more general discussion. But Dipti, you have a wonderful question. Would you like to speak it to us, or should I read it? No, you say you can articulate it better than I can.
No. I just want to say, I mean, first of all, thank you for such a rich paper in history, especially with the focus you bring on pedagogy and processes. For me, it kind of really opens up the kind of rigidity and stability that is often associated with the aquatant, especially with the images of with the aquatants of colonial India. So I felt like when you were focused on the process, thinking of the washes and the tinges and the, that in a way you were unsettling that entire rigidity. And you talked about how in settling that rigidity, how there were certain moods that were being perhaps changed. And since that's at the center of also how the picturesque is constructed and then reconstructed or reimagined, or what happens to the picturesque in different locales in the colony. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about like these gradations or kinds of moods that come into being with these transformations that take place. Are some of them, did you perceive any of them as being radical in a way, kind of a thing to what was in terms of what was introduced, that they're against the grain readings that are possible with those introductions? And I guess like I'm thinking over there in terms of the role of the grafted gaze of the assistants like Kovasji, where you introduce that for us, like, so if that can be resituated in the process, I'm sure you have examples of that. That would be something interesting to think with as well.
Yeah, thank you, Dipti. Wow, there's a lot in that question, and I love the question of moods. I mean, both there's a dialogue with the Udaipur painting that you've been, discussing, and the way in which aquatint is meant to be evocative of transient weather effects and to create a kind of feeling. There's so much. You and I have so many things to talk about. We're going to have to go offline and talk about all kinds of things. But I'll give you the short answer of about the question of particularly local informants and their role in this, right? Which is really, really crucial. And I think that is. I trace some of that out for Oriental scenery, and this has been a discussion that Holly and I have had a great deal, and Holly has taken that much further in developing who these artists were on the ground and assistants were, and so that is absolutely crucial. And what I just want to emphasize is that what aquatint does by taking the printmaking process had to be done in a metropolitan way. There are a few attempts to do aquatint on the margins. The Daniels tried to do their Calcutta series in Calcutta, and it was not financially viable for all kinds of reasons. So it's a metropolitan printing process that is often in this early period is done by the traveling artists themselves, or often the printmakers, and then that would diverge in the 19th century. But in that moment, that ability to control the whole process from traveling artist to printmaker to copyright holder of the book was also a way of very easily eliding any kind of help and making it seem like a single embodied experience with a single coherent view of, which was not at all the case when you go back and reconstruct how these views were made. In fact, some of these temples that appear in Oriental scenery were never seen by the Daniels at all. They were used exclusively from the drawings of others, including a great many Indian artists.
If I could just quickly respond to that, in some ways, like I think I'm like more, that detail that you showed about of the person who is the assistant who's holding the umbrella, like that has stuck with me. And I'm thinking more in terms of how those kind of details were negotiated, because you highlight that question of the sun, right? And that heat, and that being so much central to how the aquatant, how that mood of the aquatant is altered or not. So it's really fascinating to think with that detail in some ways, the role of sun, the role of heat, the role of that rigidity in that sense. So even not necessarily just as assistants, but as these figures are brought into the fore, in some ways, how might we be able to think about empire and negotiation of these sunny and very, the kind of complaints that were always there about being in those spaces and creating these aqueducts, if you will. So it's that possibility that was more running in my head. And
thank you, I like that.
Yeah.
Just got one last question from Heather. Heather, would you like to speak it? It's about the question of browns and dead coloring. Brilliant question. Go ahead.
Sure. I don't think I have more. I'll just ramble if I say more. But thank you so much for your talk. And yeah, I was just struck when like dead coloring and browns. It just felt like there was a lot. I mean, I know that's not a new term in the moment, but I wondered if there was any way, including as the artists are then coloring in brown figures too, if there's any kind of like subtle or explicit relationship between the two and any of the sources you're engaging.
That's great. I love it. I would say actually not in the dead coloring, but in the watercolor finishing is where skin tone particularly takes its place. And I actually cite, there are a couple of times when these aquatint books tried to compare indigenous peoples from different places, let's say China and Southern Africa. And the artists, they would turn their heads kind of, they would do it with the same technique, and then they would hand color them with exactly the same watercolor wash, and it would really emphasize the similarities if that's what they were going for. Or alternatively, they could really play up the difference by using different hand coloring. So the hand coloring and skin color is a really important aspect. Typically you're printing these aquatints in a single ink for the whole thing, and so typically you'd want to go with like a brownish color when you printed it that could take color across the whole surface.
Thank you very much. I'm sure there's many more questions for Doug, but I think we should at this point have another round of digital applause for our keynote and then have a general discussion. So let's all thank Doug for his contribution, and of course we'll all buy a copy of Aquatint Worlds to find more. Thank you.
That was so amazing. Douglas, for your amazing talk. Tim, for your brilliant moderating, as always. I was wondering if I could just ask, I could jump here and ask a question, because I also love the idea of the haptic picturesque. And I think it's so interesting because with your foregrounding of Crary, that of course is it emphasizes the eye so much. And we've been talking a lot about that role of vision. And here the role of the hand just comes so much more into play. And it made me think that even within, I mean, you've laid out so beautifully how aquatint kind of creates an imperial mode of seeing, a mode of travel. Obviously, it also reshapes, as you've so beautifully argued in multiple contexts, how the British see themselves. But do you also find within, like in the Daniel's work or within other work, that the artists do start to see some differences in the places they're going that they express that pushes back against their own use of the medium, in addition to the assistance, the local knowledge that is within the prints?
Yeah, I mean, I try to push back against this notion of like the homogenization of the picturesque, right? Because then we don't have a whole lot to say as art historians, and then the prints they're not full of evidence. But there is a kind of homogenization of style and technique at some level. What I kind of drill down on is that each book, they really are packaged as books, and this became much more important than I realized when I started this project and was thinking about it as a bunch of prints either separate or on my screen. and what you'll find is that each region has, there's very different kind of sets of pictorial concerns. And so while they all may have a watercolor from the region that looks very similar, and if you put up those prints of watercolors, you'd say, oh, look how similar they all are across the world. But in practice, what you'll find is like there's a real emphasis on commercial transactions and costume in China. There's a real emphasis on architecture in India. There's a real emphasis on animals and ethnographic depictions in Southern Africa, right? And that shapes very much the way in which the landscape, which kind of appears in all of them, is read or might be modulated. But that doesn't that doesn't totally get to your question, but that's how I've kind of answered that. That's one way I tried to answer it.
Thank you so much. Maybe we can, maybe leaping off from this point of the haptic, of the multisensory, maybe we could bring the other panelists into dialogue. And I should say, we have reached 1 o'clock. Thank you everyone who has joined us today. To those who would like to stay and continue the conversation, please do. To those who have to go, we fully understand, and we thank you and wish you well. But with that being said, I think there's so much to talk about. The conversations over the past 2 days have been so rich. Maybe we could just open up this dialogue with Douglas's talk and thinking through the medium of aquatant to also the other talks that we've heard. So maybe what I'll say is just let's perhaps start by opening it with this question of the multi-sensory, that while obviously vision is a huge part, really opening that out to the haptic, the sonic, taste, etc. And I don't know if anyone who wants to jump in. And I should say, everyone else, please just keep writing questions in the chat and we'll answer them. Maybe I'll actually just, Kailani, if you're there, I'd love to draw you into this.
I was going to ask that too.
Thinking about the sonic, well, it takes me actually to, I believe it was a question that Tim posed about the layers that are put onto place, because when I think about a melee or a chant, that it would be chanted with a very specific cadence and tone of voice that would make it more specifically from a particular place. And so in that way, it's not merely the words or names that are spoken or chanted, but also like the inflection and even the vibrato of the voice would be specific to the place that it's from. And so that tells a genealogy of the people who were your kumu or teacher in chanting, but also your genealogy of where you're from. And so in that way, placemaking tied to genealogy is it's again multivalent and multi-layered. And it seems to me that in Tim's question, there is something that feels inherent about the fact of elevation, and my brain will get there, but I also recorded a lecture on Japanisme this morning before coming, so I'm still working things out.
I can jump in a bit on this as well. I think taking from what Kailani was saying about the voice and how that is something which is central to how we might be perceiving topographies and how we might be pursuing the visual, right? So in a way, like I know this is something Deborah and I talk a lot about in looking at painterly details and how they are often about certain kinds of sounds that are exploding in what the painter is doing, and not just about a visual effect, if you will. And if we think with regards to the monsoon per se, like if one thinks about the poetry, some of the recited poetry that I wasn't able to get into, then you do get that kind of emphasis that would be sung perhaps in a heavy voice, like ghora ghorani, like, which is clouds that are bursting, or if there is a single string of water that is falling, then you just have this emphasis on a single syllable through the verse line. So I think those kinds of elements are what, in a way, structure perhaps, or at least inflect those bursts that we might see on painterly surfaces. And I bring that up because I was thinking about the question Tim had posed in the chat of thinking about this accretive quality of topography and the extractive quality, and how do we think through them together. And in a way, I think that's a question about like how we have to constantly be bringing to bear on these kinds of genres, where the genre is emphasized so much as to what is coming together and what is being pulled apart. So that's also a kind of an accretion and an extraction that is taking place, which can allow us to get into multiple questions, then thinking about that there aren't, that thinking about boundaries, but actually seeing that there might be more porosities at play in these kinds of topographies than we have acknowledged.
Chitra and Garma, maybe you want to jump in with that. I mean, it just seems to speak exactly to your project.
Actually, I'm only speaking up to suggest that maybe Garma say something here, because of this, this metaphor of layers that Tim asked about and that we've been talking about is such an explicit kind of material aspect of your work and your practice, not only in the project that you and I are doing together, but in your work as a whole, right?
I mean, I can make a point, but I don't know how much of it answers or connects to whatever you guys are talking about. So the idea of light is something that I've been exploring through the artwork itself. And I think, although it's not really like something that you can touch or feel or smell, but like it kind of changes your perception about the singularity of an image, right? Like in the process of multiplying multiple images, and by the virtue of you being able to see a single image, which kind of then transforms into something else by the virtue of switching on the light, it kind of gives you a more, I don't know if that's the right word, but like a holistic idea of, or not just like holistic, but like something that's more than just a static image. So in that, I sort of place it between an image and maybe a sort of an animation, the movement which you experience while standing in front of this artwork.
I'm also seeing in your work and some of the other, when we're thinking about the other senses that might be used, or that there's a break there. The European tradition has created a real kind of siloing of techniques and visual ways of looking that condition us to look and think a certain way about the world. And so as soon as you overlay them or cross them and or add new senses such as sound or taste or whatever to the experience, you've kind of undercut and questioned that Western visual regime in really interesting ways.
I was really moved, Garma, by your layering of drawings, and then how you animated them. So it was both the scale of this very like large scale railway map, right? And then the minute attention to the mineral itself. And the mineral, of course, becomes much larger in your drawing and it miniaturizes. And then the railroad map to me started to look like the veins within the rock. And I thought that I don't know if you would just, I'd be so interested to hear you talk about scale, because then when Douglas, you were speaking and you did that amazing where you focused in on the aquatant, and you start to see that same notion of landscape actually within the aquatant medium itself with the crags. And I don't know if you would just speak to, you know, if you would both speak to that.
Yeah, I mean, that's true, because I actually, when Chitra and I were initially discussing these specimens, she said that these were, and this is the fact that I have never seen them in real life. I've only seen just the images of them. And she mentioned that these are not like really big specimens or like anything exceptional, like they're probably all the same similar sizes. But because I've never seen them, I can just imagine them as either the whole or a part, right? Like then the distinction between my drawing the graphite as a topography in its entirety, or my drawing of apophyllite as the form of the apophyllite, there was a liberty that I could take there. And like you said, the railways as well, like of course, like they're much larger, and the scale doesn't really at no point will it suffice the specimen, but like it's the perception of how we experience history and the belonging of that specimen, how it's all intertwined now. Like yeah, I guess that's what I'm trying to say. Maybe Chitra can like speak to it more.
Yeah, I mean, one reason I've been a little bit silent right now is that I've been trying to think about these metaphors of kind of accretion and layering, the kind of like stratigraphic metaphor that we've been talking about, which, you know, really beautifully maps onto Gautama's practice. And I've been trying to think, like, does it map onto my practice as a historian investigating, you know, not just the individual specimens, but the sort of the institution of the natural history collection as a whole, which is, you know, kind of one of the motivating questions that I've come to this with, right? And I'm thinking, you know, as part of the kind of, you know, current phase of the ongoing, you know, longstanding discussion and debate over what it would look like to decolonize the Natural History Museum. And, you know, there are some metaphors, some sort of unhelpful metaphors about these museums, like the idea of the kind of container of objects, which suggests a kind of neutrality and sort of lack of interaction between the institution and the object. And I guess, you know, because I was investigating mining and mineral extraction and was trying to look at, you know, the ways in which, in order for these objects to kind of travel through their coming into being as specimens, they have to be physically extracted, sometimes from deep, deep inside the earth. You know, in the case of the apophyllite, this involves, you know, thousands of tons of dynamite and sort of blasting through these rocks. And, you know, blasting isn't an act of peeling back layers. It's a much more destructive engagement with land and its stratigraphy. And what I was seeking to do in this and seek to do in a lot of my work is to try and, you know, take some sort of action that, like, there's no decolonial act that can cancel the debts of history, right? That we take it as a given that natural history museums have never been neutral. They have developed with colonial purpose, often with racialized agendas at their core, but there are still things that we can do. There are actions that we can take that might kind of seek to build knowledge around them that is collaborative, that strives for repair, reciprocity, kind of entanglement rather than extraction. I'm sort of rambling here a little bit, but I guess it's because I'm not sure if layers are the right metaphor, and I don't know what they are then for that kind of activity that I feel I've been engaged in.
Okay. I am conscious that we are going over 3 hours of keeping everybody on Zoom, and people must be getting exhausted. But there is one last question from Julia Lum, which I think is sort of fitting. It's kind of an overview question. And also Julia was one of the people that took part in our very first topography workshop at the beginning of 2019. And I'm really glad that she's still in this conversation. And just to take that as a point that I really do hope that we're going to go away and think about further ways to develop this conversation, and that many of you will continue to participate with us. And first, then over to Julia, before we give a big round of applause to everyone. Julia, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. Thank you so much, Cindy. I feel all of a sudden this pressure as the last question, but I'll try and I'll make it brief. This has been a really fantastic group of papers. And I think it's raised important questions about how topography is narrated, and either through that being a descriptive letterpress in Doug's paper, or the multiplicity of temporal registers in Dipti and Deborah's papers. So I'm just wondering about the possibility of these mediums allowing for a recursive visual language or nonlinear forms of reading landscape. And I'm particularly thinking of actually Dipti and Deborah's, the way in which time is formulated within those compositions, but this also could perhaps relate to Kailani's idea of the mele, also the Kumulipo, as a kind of narration of biological existence too. So thanks.
I just have a little footnote I'd like to add to that. It's a great contribution. Hi, Julia, nice to see you. It's a great contribution because it does seem to me that this might take us back to the haptic and the multisensory issue, in the sense that the topographical prints that Doug was sharing with us, and this would go for any medium, not just the aquatint, are potentially chaotic. They include such a range of material, things which cannot be understood by the armchair viewer, by the person who wants to, as it were, possess the imperial terrain, but just can't understand it. And there are lots of objects that the artist who made the image didn't know what they were, so they're illegible. So there's a sort of chaos of empire there, which can only be brought under control by a kind of text which tells you what you're looking at and tells you what to do. It's the same with the panorama paintings of the period, that there's a kind of ludicrous excess of visual material, most of which is incomprehensible and only takes form as meaning when it's directed by a text which is actually the point at which, or one of the points at which, ideology becomes most visible in this process, because the texts are often far more deterministic and far more explicitly imperial than the image really is capable of being. So I mean, I think you've raised a really important point, that there's at least a two-layer process. And I think that the first layer of engagement and interaction with the image is much more haptic and offers much more in terms of multisensory delights and dangers and horrors and so on. But then the text, brings it back on this into the straight and narrow of kind of imperial, explicit imperial ideology. So it might be worth thinking about the way the text sort of closes down on possible readings of the image, and that would go for the label in the Geology Museum as well. That you can see more in that thing than the label wants you to see. So it's just a thought.
I was thinking about Julia's question because, Julia, I had been trying to do a nonlinear form of reading the landscape, hence my kind of insane diagrams of all the little dots, and trying to show how the people who looked at this painting had an embodied experience of moving in and around and through the landscape. And I thought of that as, just steal a phrase, I thought of that as haptic reception. So I'm not sure how to sort of further, I don't know, I'm quite curious if anyone could speak to this, about how to go further with this sort of recursive visual language or nonlinear forms of reading landscape.
Maybe that's a launching point for our thinking about future development. And so we might, Holly, we need to go away and think about this. And we might reach out to many of you who raise these questions. It's approaching, it's 1:17, and I think everybody's probably ready to take a break and have lunch. So thank you for everyone for these amazing papers, for opening up the question about topography as we intended, and in many unexpected ways. So big round of applause to everyone.